Welcome. Let yourself settle in, find a comfortable position, and allow your breathing to slow as we journey together through time. Back to the very beginning of the land that would one day be called Portugal. Long before there were kingdoms or castles, before there were names for these hills and rivers, there were people. The story begins in the mists of prehistory, tens of thousands of years ago, when the western edge of the Iberian Peninsula was home to hunter-gatherers who left traces of their existence in caves and rock shelters. Around 20,000 years ago, during the Upper Paleolithic period, these early inhabitants created some of the first art in this region. Simple engravings on stone, handprints on cave walls, marks that whispered, "We were here." As millennia passed and ice ages slowly released their grip on Europe, the land grew warmer, more welcoming. By around 5000 BCE, during the Neolithic period, something remarkable was happening along the Atlantic coast. Communities were no longer simply following herds and gathering what nature provided. They were settling, planting crops of wheat and barley, domesticating animals, and transforming the landscape. These were Portugal's first farmers, and with farming came something permanent: villages, traditions, and monuments to remember the dead. Between 4000–2000 BCE, across the rolling plains of the Alentejo and scattered throughout the territory, these Neolithic people constructed dolmens, massive stone tombs made of enormous slabs, some weighing several tons, carefully arranged to create chambers and passageways. The Antag Grande do Zambujeiro, near Evora, stands as one of the largest such monuments in all of the Iberian Peninsula, its capstone alone weighing an estimated 17 tons. Imagine the coordination, the shared belief, the generations of knowledge required to move such stones without wheels or metal tools. Time continued its patient march forward. Around 3000 BCE, copper began to appear in this land, marking the dawn of the Chalcolithic period, or Copper Age. In the region near modern-day Vila Nova de São Pedro, settlements grew more complex, surrounded by defensive walls. People were creating copper tools and ornaments, but also continuing to use stone, a world between ages, neither fully one nor the other. Then came bronze. Around 1800 BCE, the Bronze Age transformed the Atlantic coast once more. Bronze, that remarkable alloy of copper and tin, was harder than either metal alone, perfect for tools and weapons that could hold an edge. Trade routes stretched across the peninsula and beyond. The people of this time created the remarkable Castro culture, fortified hill settlements with circular stone houses that dotted the northern landscape. These weren't just villages. They were communities that understood defense, that worked metal with skill, that traded amber from distant shores. By around 1000 BCE, the wider world began to take notice of this western land. Phoenician traders from the eastern Mediterranean, those master sailors from cities like Tyre and Sidon, established trading posts along the southern coast. They came seeking metals, copper, tin, silver, and gold, which the interior mountains held in abundance. The Phoenicians founded settlements, including one that would grow to become Olisipo, the ancient ancestor of modern Lisbon. Can you imagine those first ships appearing on the horizon, their sails catching the Atlantic wind, bringing goods and stories from civilizations thousands of miles away? Not long after, around the 8th century BCE, Greek traders also ventured to these shores, though in smaller numbers than the Phoenicians. They brought olive trees and grapevines, gifts that would transform the agriculture of the peninsula. The Greeks called the Iberian Peninsula Ophiussa, the land of serpents, though whether this referred to actual snakes or to the winding rivers that carved through the landscape, no one can say for certain. But it was the Celts, migrating from Central Europe around the 6th century BCE, who would leave perhaps the deepest mark on the land before the coming of Rome. Celtic tribes swept into the northern and central regions, blending with the existing populations. They brought with them ironworking, new artistic styles with intricate curved patterns, and their own languages. The Lusitani, a Celtic tribe inhabiting the central regions between the Douro and Tagus rivers, would eventually give their name to the Roman province, Lusitania, and their warrior spirit would become legendary in the struggles to come. The land was no longer empty or unknown. It was layered with cultures, shaped by countless hands, enriched by trade and migration. The stage was set, the players gathering, for the great drama that would unfold when the most powerful force in the ancient world turned its eyes westward. And so Rome came, not suddenly, not all at once, but like a tide that cannot be turned back. In 218 BCE, during the Second Punic War against Carthage, Roman legions first set foot on Iberian soil. They came as liberators, or so they claimed, to drive out the Carthaginian forces of Hannibal. But Rome, once arrived, did not leave. What began as a military campaign became a conquest that would take 2 centuries to complete. The Lusitani did not submit easily. For decades, they resisted the Roman advance with fierce determination. Their mountainous homeland gave them advantage. They knew every pass, every hidden valley. They struck quickly and vanished like morning mist. Then, around 155 BCE, a shepherd emerged who would become a legend. His name was Viriathus, and for 8 years he led the Lusitanian resistance against Rome's legions. Viriathus was a brilliant tactician, using guerrilla warfare to devastating effect, ambushing Roman columns, avoiding pitched battles where Rome's discipline gave them advantage. The Romans grew so frustrated, so desperate, that they eventually resorted to treachery. In 139 BCE, Viriathus was assassinated by 3 of his own companions, men bribed by Rome with promises of land and gold. Even today, in Portugal, Viriathus is remembered as a symbol of independence, of resistance against impossible odds. With Viriathus gone, the resistance crumbled. The final conquest of the Western Peninsula was completed in 19 BCE under Emperor Augustus, who reorganized the territory into the province of Lusitania. The capital was established at Emerita Augusta, modern-day Mérida in Spain, but cities throughout the province began to flourish. The Romans brought their civilization in stone and law, roads that connected the Atlantic to the Mediterranean, aqueducts that carried water across valleys, forums where citizens gathered to debate and trade. They brought their language, Latin, which would slowly evolve over centuries into Portuguese. They brought their gods, their bathhouses, their amphitheatres for spectacles. In the south, the city of Pax Julia, today known as Beja, became a thriving Roman centre. But perhaps no city embodied Roman Lusitania more than Coimbra, located near modern Coimbra. At its height in the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, Coimbra was adorned with magnificent houses featuring intricate mosaic floors depicting mythological scenes, elaborate fountains, and advanced heating systems called hypocausts that channeled warm air beneath the floors. Walking through these ruins today, you can still see the geometric patterns, the dolphins and fish swimming in stone, frozen in time, echoes of comfort and beauty from nearly 2,000 years ago. For over 3 centuries, Lusitania knew the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Trade flourished. Olive oil and wine from Lusitanian estates were shipped across the empire. Fish sauce called garum, made along the coast, was a delicacy prized even in distant Rome. The wealthy built elaborate villas in the countryside, with farms worked by slaves and tenant farmers. Towns had running water, paved streets, public entertainment. Latin poets wrote verses. Roman law governed disputes. Children learned to read and write. It was an age of order, of certainty, of civilization. But civilizations, like everything else, do not last forever. As the 3rd century drew to a close, Christianity began to spread through the Roman Empire, and Lusitania was no exception. By the 4th century CE, Christianity had become the official religion of Rome under Emperor Constantine. The old temples to Jupiter and Mars fell silent, were abandoned or converted. Churches rose in their place. Bishops became powerful figures in cities. A new worldview was taking root, one that promised salvation not through earthly glory, but through faith. In Lusitania, early Christian communities gathered in secret at first, then openly. The remains of early Christian basilicas have been found at Matola and other sites, their simple stone altars marking a profound spiritual transformation. But by the early 5th century, the world was changing in ways the Romans could scarcely comprehend. The great empire that had seemed eternal was fracturing. Far to the east and north, barbarian tribes were on the move, pushed by forces even further beyond, migrations of peoples seeking new lands, fleeing harsher climates and stronger enemies. In 409 CE, these distant troubles arrived at Lusitania's doorstep. Germanic tribes, the Vandals, the Alans, and the Suevi, crossed the Pyrenees and swept into the Iberian Peninsula. The Suevi, a Germanic people, eventually settled in the northwest, establishing a kingdom with its capital at Bracara Augusta, today's Braga. The Roman order was dissolving. Imperial officials found themselves powerless. Roman legions, withdrawn to defend Italy itself, were no longer present to maintain control. The Suevi kingdom lasted for over 150 years, a Germanic realm superimposed on the bones of Roman Lusitania. The Suevi adopted much from the civilization they had conquered. They converted to Christianity in the mid-6th century under King Carrieric, embraced Latin as the language of administration, and maintained some Roman structures. Yet they were also distinct, bringing their own customs, their own warrior culture, their own laws. Cities continued, but they were smaller now, less grand. The countryside became more important, more self-sufficient. The great estates, the latifundia worked by hundreds, became the nuclei of new feudal relationships between lords and peasants. Then, in 585 CE, the Visigothic kingdom, which had established itself in the central and eastern regions of the peninsula, turned its attention west. King Leovigild conquered the Suevi kingdom, absorbing it into his own realm. The Visigoths, another Germanic people who had sacked Rome itself in 410, now ruled nearly all of Iberia. They established Toledo as their capital, far to the east. For the land that would become Portugal, this meant becoming a distant province of a Gothic kingdom, governed from afar. The Visigoths, too, were Christian, though initially they followed a different form called Arianism, before converting to Catholic Christianity under King Reccared in 589. Latin continued to evolve, blending with Germanic words, beginning its slow transformation into something new. For nearly 2 more centuries, the Visigoths ruled. The old Roman cities endured, diminished but still alive. Bishops became the true powers in their localities, maintaining literacy, preserving fragments of classical learning in monastery libraries. Trade dwindled. Roads fell into disrepair. The Mediterranean world was fragmenting into smaller, more isolated communities. And yet life continued. Farmers planted and harvested. Blacksmiths forged tools, mothers sang lullabies to children, the cycle of seasons turned as it always had. But far to the south, across the Strait of Gibraltar, a new force was rising, one that would transform the peninsula yet again. In the year 711, everything changed. Across the narrow strait that separated Africa from Europe, a force was gathering, not merely an army, but the vanguard of a new civilization. The Islamic expansion, which had begun in the Arabian Peninsula less than a century before, had swept across North Africa with remarkable speed. Now it stood at the edge of Europe, and the Visigothic kingdom, weakened by internal strife and civil war, was about to fall. A Berber general named Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed the strait with an army of around 7,000 men, mostly Berbers from North Africa, warriors hardened by desert campaigns. They landed at the great rock that would bear Tariq's name, Jabal Tariq, the mountain of Tariq, which we know today as Gibraltar. The Visigothic king, Roderick, marched south to meet this threat. At the Battle of Guadalete, somewhere in southern Iberia, the two forces clashed. The battle lasted several days, but when it ended, King Roderick was dead, and the Visigothic army was shattered. The kingdom that had ruled for 2 centuries collapsed almost overnight. Within 3 years, by 714, Muslim forces had conquered nearly the entire Iberian Peninsula. The speed was breathtaking. The age of Al-Andalus had begun. The Muslims called their new territory Al-Andalus, and they brought with them a civilization of remarkable sophistication. They were not a single unified people, but a complex mixture. Arabs from the Middle East who formed the aristocracy, Berbers from North Africa who who comprised most of the armies and settlers, and increasingly, local Iberians who converted to Islam, known as Muladis. In the western regions, the land that would become Portugal, the Muslim presence was initially lighter than in the south and centre. Many local populations in the north, in the mountainous regions, remained Christian, paying tribute but maintaining a degree of autonomy. The Muslims established the Emirate of Córdoba in 756 under Abd al-Rahman I, a survivor of the Umayyad dynasty who had escaped the massacre of his family in Damascus. Córdoba, far to the east of what would become Portugal, grew into one of the most magnificent cities in all of Europe, perhaps in the entire world. At its height in the 10th century, Córdoba boasted a population of perhaps 500,000 people, with paved streets, street lighting, running water, public baths, libraries containing hundreds of thousands of books, and a breathtaking great mosque with its forest of columns and horseshoe arches. While much of Christian Europe struggled in relative poverty and isolation, Al-Andalus flourished as a centre of learning, trade, and culture. In the Western territories, cities began to transform under Muslim rule. Olisipo became Alaspuna, a fortified settlement overlooking the river. Santarém, a strategic town on the Tagus, was known as Chantarin. Irrigation systems were improved or constructed. The Muslims brought sophisticated water management techniques from the Middle East, including the Nora, a water wheel turned by animals, and complex networks of channels that made dry land fertile. They introduced new crops that would become staples of Portuguese agriculture: rice, which thrived in the watered valleys, citrus fruits like oranges and lemons, almonds and figs, and new varieties of vegetables. The landscape itself was being reshaped, terraced hillsides catching precious water, orchards spreading across once barren slopes. Meditative pause. But in the far north, in the rugged mountains of Asturias and Galicia, where Muslim control was weakest, Christian kingdoms were taking root. As early as 718, just 7 years after the initial invasion, a Visigothic nobleman named Pelagius, Pelayo in Spanish, led a small band of warriors to victory against a Muslim force at the Battle of Covadonga in the mountains of Asturias. It was a minor skirmish in strategic terms, but it became symbolic, legendary, the beginning of what Christians would call the Reconquista, the reconquest of Iberia. These northern Christian kingdoms slowly expanded southward over the following centuries, a process that would take nearly 800 years to complete. By the 9th century, the county of Portugal began to emerge as a distinct territory. It was initially a frontier region of the Kingdom of Leon, tasked with defending the northern Christian lands against Muslim raids from the south. The name Portugal itself derives from Portus Cale, an ancient settlement at the mouth of the Douro River, the combination of the Roman port and the pre-Roman settlement of Cale. This county stretched roughly from the Mijo River in the north to the Mondego River in the south, a green land of hills and valleys, forests and rivers, quite different from the arid plains further south that remained under Muslim control. During the 10th and early 11th centuries, Al-Andalus reached its zenith under the Caliphate of Córdoba. Abd al-Rahman III declared himself caliph in 929, establishing Al-Andalus as an independent caliphate rivaling those of Baghdad and Cairo. This was the golden age of Moorish Iberia, a time of religious tolerance, where Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived side by side, contributing to a remarkable flowering of poetry, philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. Scholars translated ancient Greek texts into Arabic, preserving knowledge that had been lost in Christian Europe. In the western reaches of the Caliphate, even in territories only loosely controlled, this prosperity brought improved trade, better roads, and a circulation of ideas. But golden ages, like summer days, do not last forever. In 1031, the Caliphate of Córdoba collapsed into civil war, fragmenting into dozens of small kingdoms called taifas, party kingdoms, each ruled by its own petty king. This fragmentation was both a blessing and a curse. The taifas competed with each other in patronage of the arts and learning, trying to outdo one another in cultural sophistication. Poets and philosophers found generous patrons. Architecture reached new heights of elegance. Yet the taifas were also weak, vulnerable. They fought among themselves, and crucially, they began paying tribute to the Christian kingdoms in the north to secure alliances and avoid conquest. Tribute paid in gold, which enriched the Christian realms and funded their armies. In the western territories, the Taifa of Badajoz emerged as the dominant Muslim power, controlling much of what is now central Portugal and Extremadura. Meanwhile, the Christian county of Portugal, though still technically subject to the Kingdom of Leon, was growing in strength and ambition. The stage was being set for a dramatic transformation. The balance of power was shifting, slowly but inexorably, from south to north, from Muslim to Christian. The land that would become Portugal stood at the frontier of two worlds, absorbing influences from both, being shaped by conflict and coexistence alike. The frontier was a place of complexity, not a simple line between enemies, but a region where cultures blended, where Muslim farmers might pledge allegiance to Christian lords, where knights might fight for either side depending on payment, where merchants crossed back and forth carrying silk and spices, wool and iron. Languages mixed, Arabic words seeping into the evolving Romance dialects. Architecture borrowed freely, horseshoe arches in Christian churches, fortification techniques shared across battle lines. It was a world of violence, yes, but also of surprising fluidity, of unexpected cooperation, of grudging respect. And in this world of shifting allegiances and ancient rivalries, a nation was about to be born. The story of Portugal as an independent nation begins not with a king, but with a count. His name was Henry of Burgundy, a French nobleman and crusader who arrived in Iberia around 1095 to fight in the Reconquista. King Alfonso VI of Leon and Castile, impressed by Henry's prowess and eager to secure the loyalty of foreign warriors, granted him the hand of his illegitimate daughter, Teresa, in marriage. As a wedding gift, Alfonso bestowed upon Henry the county of Portugal, that frontier territory between the Mijo and Mondego rivers. It was meant to be a vassal state, subordinate to Leon, a buffer zone against Muslim raids from the south. But Henry, and more importantly his descendants, had different dreams. Henry of Burgundy died in 1112, leaving his young son Afonso Henriquez as heir, with Teresa acting as regent. Teresa was a formidable woman who ruled the county with skill, but as Afonso grew older, tensions emerged between mother and son over the direction of the realm and her alliance with a Galician nobleman. In 1128, at the Battle of São Mamede near Guimarães, Afonso Henriquez defeated his mother's forces and took control of the county. He was only 19 years old, but he possessed fierce ambition and a clear vision. He would not be merely a count subject to Leon. He would be a king. For the next decade, Afonso Henriquez worked tirelessly to expand his territory southward, pushing against the Muslim Taifas, and to assert his independence from his cousin, Alfonso VII of Leon and Castile. Then came a pivotal moment. On July 25, 1139, at Urique in the Alentejo, Afonso Henriquez led his forces against a much larger Muslim army. The exact details of the battle are shrouded in legend. Later chronicles would claim that Christ himself appeared to Afonso before the battle, promising victory, but what matters is the outcome. Against the odds, the Portuguese forces won decisively. Following this victory, Afonso Henriquez proclaimed himself King Afonso I of Portugal. It was an audacious move, declaring sovereignty without permission from Leon or recognition from the Pope, but it was the symbolic birth of the Portuguese nation. Official recognition took longer. Alfonso VII of Leon was not pleased with his vassal's presumption, and the two engaged in sporadic warfare throughout the 1140s. But Afonso I was relentless in his expansion southward, capturing key fortresses and cities from Muslim control. In 1147, a pivotal opportunity arrived. The Second Crusade was passing through Iberia on its way to the Holy Land. Afonso I convinced a fleet of crusaders, including English, German, and Flemish warriors, to delay their journey and help him capture Lisbon, which had been under Muslim rule for over 4 centuries. After a brutal siege lasting 4 months, Lisbon fell on October 25, 1147. The capture of Lisbon was transformative. It gave Portugal a major port city, access to maritime trade, and a new capital that would eventually replace Coimbra. The first king of Portugal had secured his kingdom's future. Rome finally acknowledged reality. In 1179, through the papal bull Manifestus Probatum, Pope Alexander III formally recognized Portugal as an independent kingdom and Afonso Henriquez as its king. Portugal was now legitimate in the eyes of Christendom, no longer a rebellious county but a sovereign nation. The recognition came with conditions, of course. Portugal owed allegiance to the Church and would pay an annual tribute to Rome, but the essential fact remained. A new kingdom had been born on Europe's western edge, the first of the Iberian Christian kingdoms to achieve complete independence from Leon. Afonso I continued to push southward, capturing Santarém in 1147 and extending Portuguese control down to the Tagus River. His reign lasted an extraordinary 57 years until his death in 1185, making him one of the longest-reigning monarchs in Portuguese history. By the time he died, at around age 76, a remarkable age for a medieval warrior, he had transformed a small frontier county into a recognized kingdom stretching from the Mijo River to the Tagus. But the Reconquista was far from complete. The entire southern region, the Algarve, remained under Muslim control, and consolidating Portuguese rule over even the conquered territories would take decades more. Afonso I was succeeded by his son, Sancho I, known as the Populator, for his efforts to settle the newly conquered territories with Christian populations. The land taken from the Muslims was often depopulated. Inhabitants had fled or been expelled, and empty land could not be defended or made productive. Sancho I encouraged settlers from the north to move south, granted lands to military orders like the Knights Templar and the Order of Santiago, and built castles throughout the realm. The Templars, in particular, received vast territories in central Portugal, establishing their headquarters at Tomar. These warrior monks became crucial to Portugal's defence and expansion, their white mantles with red crosses a common sight along the frontier. During the late 12th and early 13th centuries, the Christian kingdoms faced a new threat. Alarmed by Christian advances, the Muslim Taifas in Iberia called for help from North Africa, and the Almohads, a powerful Berber dynasty, crossed the strait and imposed their strict rule over Al-Andalus. The Almohads were formidable warriors and religious zealots, far more unified than the fractious Taifas. They pushed back against the Christian kingdoms, winning significant victories. But the Almohad intervention also hardened religious divisions, ending much of the previous era's cultural coexistence, and making the conflict between Christian and Muslim Iberia more absolute, more defined by faith than by feudal politics. The decisive turning point came in 1212 at the Battle of Los Navas de Tolosa, fought far to the east in the mountains of Andalusia. A coalition of Christian kingdoms, Castile, Aragon, Navarre, and Portugal, along with crusaders from across Europe, faced the Almohad Caliph and his army. The Portuguese contingent, though smaller than those of the larger kingdoms, fought with distinction. The Christian coalition won a crushing victory, breaking Almohad power in Iberia forever. After Los Navas de Tolosa, Muslim resistance became fragmented, weakened, retreating. The balance had tipped decisively, and the Christian kingdoms could now resume their southward expansion with renewed confidence. In the decades following Los Navas de Tolosa, Portuguese kings continued the Reconquista within their own borders. Under King Afonso II and his successor Sancho II, Portuguese forces pushed further into the Alentejo, capturing Alcácer do Sal in 1217 with the help of yet another crusading force. The Alentejo's rolling plains, so different from the green hills of the north, began to fill with Portuguese settlers, with military orders holding vast estates, with castles overlooking every strategic height. The kingdom was taking shape, expanding, consolidating, becoming something more than a warrior state on a perpetual frontier. It was becoming a realm with institutions, laws, trade, and an emerging sense of identity. By the mid-13th century, Portugal stood poised to complete its Reconquista. Only the Algarve remained under Muslim control, a sun-drenched southern coast of fishing villages and ancient fortresses. The kingdom had survived its precarious birth, had won recognition, had pushed steadily southward against fierce resistance. The Portuguese were learning not just to conquer, but to govern, to settle, to build lasting structures. Monasteries rose in the countryside, centres of prayer and learning where monks copied manuscripts and tended vineyards. Towns received charters defining their rights and obligations. A legal code was being assembled. The Church provided not just spiritual guidance but administrative expertise, bishops and abbots often serving as royal councillors and diplomats. And soon, very soon, Portugal would reach the sea that would define its destiny. The completion of Portugal's Reconquista came under a king who would prove to be among the nation's greatest. Afonso III, who took the throne in 1248 after a period of internal strife, turned his attention to the last Muslim stronghold, the Algarve. This southern coast, with its whitewashed towns, sheltered harbours, and almond groves, had remained largely independent, paying tribute but maintaining its own identity. Afonso III, methodical and determined, launched a systematic campaign. Town by town, fortress by fortress, the Algarve came under Portuguese control. By 1249, the final Muslim garrison at Faro had surrendered. Portugal had reached its natural southern boundary, the Atlantic coast. The Reconquista, at least within Portuguese borders, was complete. The kingdom's borders were essentially established, and remarkably, they have remained virtually unchanged for over 750 years, making Portugal one of the oldest nation-states in Europe with stable frontiers. With the military conquest finished, Afonso III turned to the complex work of governance. He was not content to rule through feudal custom alone. He sought to centralize royal authority and create lasting institutions. In 1254, Afonso III convened the first Cortes in the city of Leiria. The Cortes was an assembly that brought together representatives from the three estates of the realm, the clergy, the nobility, and, crucially, the common people of the towns. This inclusion of commoners in matters of governance was relatively progressive for medieval Europe, where such assemblies often included only nobles and churchmen. The Cortes would meet periodically to advise the king, approve taxes, and address grievances. It was not democracy as we understand it, but it was a step toward shared governance, a recognition that the king's power was not absolute, and that the realm's various groups had voices that deserved hearing. Afonso III also undertook a comprehensive inquiry into land ownership throughout the kingdom. Many nobles and church institutions had expanded their holdings during the conquest, sometimes through questionable means, and the king needed to know exactly what lands belonged to the crown, what to the church, and what to private lords. Royal officials travelled from town to town, recording testimony, examining documents, compiling detailed records. This was bureaucratic state-building in action, not glamorous, but essential. A kingdom needed more than warriors. It needed clerks and records, courts and laws, a functioning administration that could collect taxes and dispense justice. The 14th century brought new challenges and transformations. King Dinas, who reigned from 1279 to 1325, earned the epithet the Farmer King for his attention to agriculture and rural development. Dinas understood that a kingdom's strength lay not only in castles and soldiers, but in productive land and prosperous farmers. He established the first university in Portugal, initially in Lisbon in 1290, which later moved to Coimbra, where it remains to this day, one of the oldest continuously operating universities in the world. He promoted the planting of pine forests, particularly the vast pine forest of Leiria, to provide timber for shipbuilding and to stabilize coastal sands. He negotiated agreements with nobility and clergy, balancing their interests with royal authority. And significantly, when the Knights Templar were suppressed by the Pope in 1312 under pressure from the French king, their wealth confiscated, their order dissolved, Dinis acted to preserve their presence in Portugal by founding the Order of Christ in 1319, transferring the Templars' Portuguese holdings and mission to this new order under Portuguese royal control. But the 14th century also brought catastrophe. In 1348, the Black Death arrived in Portugal, likely through ships docking at Lisbon carrying rats infected with plague-bearing fleas. The plague swept through the kingdom with horrifying speed. Estimates suggest that between 1/3 and 1/2 of Portugal's population died within 2 years. Villages were abandoned. Fields went unploughed. The dead were sometimes buried in mass graves, sometimes simply left where they fell because there was no one left to carry them. The psychological impact was immense. How could people understand such indiscriminate death? Many saw it as divine punishment, leading to waves of religious fervor, processions of flagellants whipping themselves in penance, and unfortunately, persecution of scapegoats, particularly Jewish communities who were sometimes blamed for the plague despite suffering equally from it. The Black Death reshaped Portuguese society. Labour became scarce and therefore more valuable, giving surviving peasants more bargaining power with their lords. The old feudal order was weakening, though it would take centuries to fully dissolve. The mid-14th century also saw Portugal drawn into the larger conflicts of Europe. The 100 Years' War between England and France cast a long shadow, and Portugal needed to choose its alliances carefully. In 1373, King Fernando I signed the Treaty of Taggart with England, the first of several alliances between the two kingdoms. But Fernando's reign was troubled. He attempted to claim the Castilian throne, leading to wars with Castile that devastated Portuguese territory. When Fernando died in 1383, he left only a daughter, Beatriz, who was married to King Juan I of Castile. The Castilian king claimed the Portuguese throne through his wife, and many Portuguese nobles, seeing advantage or inevitability, supported his claim. But not everyone accepted Castilian rule. A crisis emerged, the succession crisis of 1383 to 1385, a pivotal moment in Portuguese history that would determine whether Portugal would remain independent or be absorbed by its larger neighbour. The merchant classes, many nobles, and common people rallied around an alternative candidate. João, master of the Order of Avis, an illegitimate son of King Pedro I and therefore Fernando's half-brother. João was proclaimed defender of the realm, and later king by the Cortes of Coimbra in 1385. But proclaiming a king was one thing. Defending that choice against Castilian might was another. On August 14, 1385, the matter was decided by battle. At Aljubarrota, a small town north of Lisbon, João I and his general Nuno Alvares Pereira, a brilliant young commander and deeply religious man who would later be canonized as a saint, positioned a much smaller Portuguese force to meet a massive Castilian invasion army. The Portuguese numbered perhaps 6,500 men, the Castilians perhaps 30,000. The odds were overwhelming, but João and Nuno chose their ground carefully, forcing the Castilians to attack uphill over difficult terrain. The Portuguese infantry held firm, armed with long pikes and crossbows. English longbowmen, sent as allies, poured arrows into the Castilian cavalry. The battle lasted barely an hour, but when it ended, the Castilian army was shattered, fleeing in disarray. thousands of Castilians lay dead on the field. Portugal's independence had been secured through valor and blood. The Battle of Aljubarrota became the defining moment of Portuguese national identity, proof that the small kingdom could stand against overwhelming force, that independence was worth any sacrifice. To commemorate the victory, João I ordered the construction of a magnificent monastery at Batalha, literally battle, dedicated to the Virgin Mary. The monastery of Batalha, built in the Gothic style with soaring arches, intricate stonework, and stunning stained glass, would take over a century to complete. It stands today as one of Portugal's greatest architectural achievements, a prayer in stone, a monument not just to military victory but to national survival. João I also solidified the alliance with England. In 1386, he signed the Treaty of Windsor with England's Richard II, an alliance that has endured to this day, making it the oldest active alliance in the world. The treaty was sealed in 1387 when João married Philippa of Lancaster, daughter of John of Gaunt, cementing English-Portuguese bonds through marriage and mutual interest. João I's reign, which lasted until 1433, became known as a golden age. With independence secure and peace gradually returning, Portugal could turn its attention outward, toward the Atlantic Ocean that had always defined its western boundary. The king and queen had several remarkable sons, raised in a court that valued learning, piety, chivalry, and ambition. These princes, particularly Prince Henry, later known as Henry the Navigator, would look beyond Portugal's shores and wonder what lay beyond the horizon. The kingdom was small, hemmed in on the east by Castile, but to the west was infinity. The age of exploration was about to dawn, and Portugal would lead the way. Prince Henry was born in 1394, the third son of King João I and Queen Philippa. As a younger son, he would not inherit the throne, which gave him a certain freedom to pursue his own vision. That vision was shaped by a singular question: what lay beyond the sea? In 1415, at age 21, Henry participated in the Portuguese conquest of Ceuta, a Muslim port city on the North African coast across the strait from Gibraltar. The capture of Ceuta was motivated by many factors: crusading zeal, the desire to control trade routes, the need to prove Portuguese martial valor. But for Henry, the expedition opened his eyes to something profound. In Ceuta, he encountered merchants who spoke of gold from Guinea, of trade routes across the Sahara, of African kingdoms rich beyond European imagination. He realized that the Muslim middlemen who controlled these routes could be bypassed if Portuguese ships could sail down the African coast and reach these lands directly by sea. After Ceuta, Henry withdrew to Sagres, on Portugal's southwestern cape, the very edge of the known world. Later storytellers would embellish this, imagining a grand school of navigation, a romantic notion, but not quite accurate. What Henry established was more informal, but no less important, a gathering place for cartographers, shipbuilders, astronomers, and sailors. He funded expedition after expedition down the African coast, each one pushing a little further into the unknown. The work was slow, sometimes maddeningly so. Sailors were terrified of what lay beyond Cape Bojeda, a bulging point on the African coast. Legends spoke of boiling seas, of waters that would turn a man's skin black, of sea monsters waiting in the depths. The Cape had strong currents and dangerous shoals, and the winds made return voyages difficult. For 15 years, Henry's expeditions tried and failed to round Cape Bojada. Then, in 1434, one of Henry's squires, Gil Eanes, finally succeeded in sailing beyond Cape Bojada and returning safely. It was a psychological breakthrough as much as a geographical one. The terrors were revealed as myth. The sea beyond was merely sea. Dangerous, yes, but navigable. After Gil Eanes, progress accelerated. Portuguese caravels, a new ship design combining square sails for speed with triangular lateen sails for maneuverability, pushed further south each year. In 1441, Antíogon Calvez and Nuno Tristeo reached the coast of Mauritania and brought back gold dust and African captives, the beginning of the tragic slave trade that would stain the age of exploration. In 1444, Dinis Dias reached the mouth of the Senegal River. The Portuguese were mapping coastline that no European had seen, encountering peoples and kingdoms unknown to Christendom. Reflective pause. Prince Henry died in 1460, having never travelled on these voyages himself. He remained in Portugal, organizing, funding, gathering information, dreaming. His contribution was not personal discovery, but the systematic pursuit of knowledge, the patient accumulation of maritime expertise, the willingness to invest in expeditions that might fail or bring no immediate profit. Later generations would call him the navigator, though he never navigated, but the name captures something true. He set Portugal on a course that would change the world. After his death, the voyages continued under royal patronage. King Afonso V and then King João II supported the explorations, seeing both spiritual mission and commercial opportunity in reaching the source of African gold and in finding a sea route to the Indies, to the legendary spice-producing lands of Asia. In 1482, the navigator Diogo Chao reached the mouth of the Congo River, an enormous waterway flowing from the heart of Africa. He made contact with the Kingdom of Congo, a sophisticated African state, and established diplomatic relations. Portuguese priests would later travel to the Congo court, and the Congo king would convert to Christianity, creating a complex relationship between the two kingdoms. Chao erected stone pillars called podros at key points along the coast, markers of Portuguese presence, topped with crosses, inscribed with the Portuguese coat of arms. These podros stood as lonely sentinels, announcing to any who might pass that Portugal had been here, had claimed this coast in the name of God and King. The ultimate goal remained distant, to round the southern tip of Africa and find the sea route to India. In 1487, King João II dispatched Bartolomeu Dias with 3 ships and a mandate to push as far south as possible. Dias sailed down the familiar African coast, then into unknown waters. Storms drove his ships far to the south, out of sight of land. When the weather cleared and Dias turned east expecting to find the African coast, he found only open ocean. He turned north, and there was land, but the coast ran east to west, not north to south. Dias had done it. Without realizing it in the storm, he had rounded the southern cape of Africa. He had found the way to the Indian Ocean. Dias wanted to continue to press on to India, but his crew was exhausted, frightened, on the edge of mutiny. Reluctantly, Dias turned back. On the return voyage, he sighted the great cape itself, calling it Cabo dos Tormentas, the Cape of Storms, for the fierce weather he had endured. But King João II, recognizing the strategic significance, renamed it Cabo de Boa Esperança, the Cape of Good Hope, for it was indeed the gateway to the riches of the East. Portugal now knew the way to India, but before they could exploit this knowledge, politics intervened. King João II died in 1495, succeeded by his cousin Manuel I, who would become known as the Fortunate. Manuel inherited a kingdom on the brink of greatness, with the route to India mapped but not yet sailed. He quickly commissioned an expedition to complete what Dias had begun. The man chosen to lead it was Vasco da Gama, a relatively minor nobleman from Sines, but one with a reputation for toughness and navigational skill. On July 8, 1497, Vasco da Gama departed Lisbon with 4 ships and about 170 men. They carried gifts for Indian rulers, trade goods, and a determination to reach India or die trying. The voyage was an ordeal. Da Gama sailed far out into the Atlantic in a wide arc to catch favorable winds, a daring strategy that meant months out of sight of land. Scurvy ravaged the crew, their gums bleeding, teeth falling out, bodies weakening from vitamin deficiency. But Da Gama was a harsh disciplinarian who kept iron control. By November, they had rounded the Cape of Good Hope and entered the Indian Ocean. They stopped along the East African coast at Mozambique and Mombasa, encountering Swahili city-states where Muslim merchants had long traded. The Portuguese were startled to find these sophisticated coastal cities, rich in gold and ivory, connected by monsoon winds to trade networks stretching to India and beyond. Finally, with the help of an Arab navigator, Da Gama's fleet crossed the Indian Ocean, and on May 20, 1498, nearly a year after leaving Lisbon, they arrived at Calicut on the southwestern coast of India. Vasco da Gama had done what Columbus had sought, found a sea route to the Indies. But while Columbus had stumbled upon an unknown continent, Da Gama had reached the actual India, the source of the spices that Europe craved, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, which were worth more than gold in European markets. The reception at Calicut was mixed. The local ruler, the Zamarin, was willing to trade but unimpressed by the Portuguese gifts, which seemed paltry compared to the wealth flowing through Calicut from Arab and Indian merchants who had been trading there for centuries. Nevertheless, Da Gama loaded his ships with spices and began the long journey home. The return voyage was even more brutal. Crossing the Indian Ocean against the monsoon winds took months, and more men died of scurvy. Of the 170 men who had departed Lisbon, fewer than 55 returned. But they brought spices, and they brought knowledge, and they brought proof that the sea route to India was viable. When Vasco da Gama reached Lisbon in September 1499, Portugal erupted in celebration. King Manuel I understood immediately what this meant. Portugal, a small kingdom on Europe's periphery, could now bypass the Mediterranean merchants, the Venetian middlemen, the Ottoman-controlled land routes, and trade directly with Asia. The economic and strategic implications were staggering. Manuel commissioned more expeditions, larger fleets, armed vessels to protect Portuguese interests. Within a few years, Portugal would establish fortified trading posts from Africa to India to Southeast Asia, creating a maritime empire that stretched halfway around the globe. The age of exploration had reached its first great culmination, and Portugal stood at its center, master of the sea routes, gateway between continents. The small kingdom that had fought for centuries just to exist was now reshaping the world. The turn of the 16th century brought Portugal to the height of its power and ambition. King Manuel I, determined to exploit da Gama's discovery, sent a massive fleet to India in 1500 under the command of Pedro Álvares Cabral. 13 ships carrying over 1,200 men, it was the largest expedition yet, intended not merely to trade but to establish permanent Portuguese presence in the Indian Ocean. Cabral followed da Gama's route, sailing far west into the Atlantic to catch the favorable winds. But whether by accident, miscalculation, or secret intent, historians still debate. Cabral sailed further west than necessary. On April 22, 1500, his fleet sighted land. They had reached the coast of what is now Brazil. Cabral claimed this land for Portugal, naming it Terra de Vera Cruz, land of the True Cross. He sent a ship back to Lisbon with news of the discovery, then continued on to India as planned. The existence of this vast South American territory would not be fully appreciated for years. Initially, Brazil seemed a curiosity, a forested coast with no obvious wealth. But it was Portuguese, and it lay fortuitously on the Portuguese side of the line drawn by the Treaty of Tordesillas. The Treaty of Tordesillas, signed in 1494 between Portugal and Spain, had divided the entire world beyond Europe between the two Iberian powers. Pope Alexander VI had initially drawn a line of demarcation, but Portugal negotiated to move it further west, 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. Everything east of this line belonged to Portugal's sphere of exploration and conquest, everything west to Spain's. It seemed impossibly presumptuous, two kingdoms dividing the unknown world between them, but both were Catholic powers with papal blessing, and other European nations, though they would later ignore these claims, had not yet begun their own overseas expansion. The treaty gave Portugal rights to Africa, India, and ultimately Brazil, while Spain received most of the Americas. It was a division that would shape colonial history for centuries. Through the early 1500s, Portugal moved aggressively to dominate Indian Ocean trade. Alfonso de Albuquerque, perhaps the greatest of Portugal's imperial strategists, became governor of Portuguese India in 1509. Albuquerque understood that controlling trade required controlling strategic choke points. In 1510, he captured Goa on the western coast of India, which would remain the capital of Portuguese India for 4.5 centuries. In 1511, he seized Malacca, the crucial strait controlling access to the Spice Islands, modern-day Indonesia, where cloves, nutmeg, and mace grew. In 1515, he captured Hormuz, commanding the entrance to the Persian Gulf. These weren't colonies in the traditional sense. Portugal lacked the population to settle vast territories. Instead, they were fortified trading posts, a string of strategic strongholds connected by ships, creating what historians call a thalassocracy, an empire of the seas. The wealth flowing into Lisbon was extraordinary. Pepper, which had once been worth its weight in silver in European markets, now arrived by the shipload. Spices that had travelled overland through countless middlemen now came directly on Portuguese carracks. Silk from China, porcelain, precious woods, gemstones. Lisbon became one of Europe's wealthiest cities, its docks crowded with ships from across the known world. King Manuel I earned his epithet, the Fortunate. He had inherited a kingdom on the verge of greatness and lived to see it realized. He built monuments to this wealth, most notably the magnificent Geronimo's Monastery in Belém, just outside Lisbon, constructed in the ornate Manueline style, a uniquely Portuguese architectural expression combining Gothic structures with maritime motifs, twisted ropes in stone, coral-like decorations, armillary spheres, celebrating the age of discovery in limestone and marble. But Portugal's maritime empire faced challenges from the beginning. The distances were immense. 6 months to sail to India in good conditions, longer if delayed by storms or calms. Ships were lost to weather, to disease, to combat with rivals. The mortality rate on these voyages was staggering. Perhaps 1/3 of sailors never returned. Maintaining the string of fortresses required constant resupply and reinforcement. And Portugal was a small country, with a population of perhaps 1.5 million. Every man sent to India or Brazil was a man not farming, not producing at home. The empire stretched Portuguese resources to their absolute limit. In 1517, the world changed in ways that would eventually impact Portugal profoundly. In distant Germany, a monk named Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door, sparking the Protestant Reformation. Portugal, so closely tied to the Catholic Church, its explorations blessed by papal bulls, its identity shaped by the Reconquista against Muslim rule, would remain staunchly Catholic. But the religious unity of Western Christendom was fracturing. Within decades, Protestant nations like England and the Netherlands would become maritime rivals, challenging Portuguese and Spanish dominance of global trade, and religious difference would add ideological fuel to commercial competition. Portugal's eastward expansion continued. In 1543, Portuguese traders became the first Europeans to reach Japan when a Chinese junk carrying Portuguese merchants was blown off course and landed at Tonegashima. The Japanese were fascinated by the Portuguese firearms, arquebus, and quickly learned to manufacture them, transforming Japanese warfare. Portuguese Jesuit missionaries, particularly Francis Xavier, arrived in Japan in 1549, finding a culture sophisticated and complex, so different from anything Europeans had encountered. Thousands of Japanese converted to Christianity over the following decades, though this would eventually lead to persecution when Japanese rulers came to see Christianity as a threat to their authority. Meanwhile, back in Europe, Portugal faced a growing problem, the question of succession. King João III, who reigned from 1521 to 1557, had multiple children, but tragedy struck repeatedly. His sons died young. Disease, accident, the cruel lottery of mortality. By the time João III died, His only surviving grandson, Sebastio, was just 3 years old. Sebastio grew up under regents, educated in an atmosphere of crusading fervor and chivalric romance, dreaming of military glory. He became king in his own right at age 14 in 1568, but he was ill-suited to the patient work of governance. Sebastio dreamed, instead of leading a new crusade in North Africa, of conquering Muslim territories, of winning honor and glory as his ancestors had. In 1578, King Sebastio, now 24 years old, launched his crusade. He assembled an army of perhaps 17,000 men, Portuguese troops, mercenaries, adventurers seeking fortune, and sailed to Morocco to support a claimant to the Moroccan throne against his rivals. On August 4, 1578, at Alcácer Quibir in the Moroccan interior, Sebastio's army met a much larger Moroccan force. The battle was a catastrophe. The Portuguese were surrounded, outnumbered, fighting in unfamiliar terrain under the scorching North African sun. The army was annihilated. Thousands of Portuguese nobles and soldiers died on the field. King Sebastio himself perished in the battle. His body was never definitively identified, leading to legends that he had survived and would one day return. This disaster at Alcácer Quibir, called the Battle of Three Kings because 3 monarchs died there, had devastating consequences for Portugal. The cream of Portuguese nobility was dead or captured, requiring enormous ransoms. The treasury was bankrupted, and most critically, Portugal's king was dead without an heir. The succession fell to Sebastio's great-uncle, Cardinal Henry, already an elderly man who had taken holy vows and could not marry. He ruled for less than 2 years before dying in 1580, and with him died the House of Avis, the dynasty that had ruled Portugal since João I's triumph at Aljubarrota nearly 2 centuries earlier. Multiple claimants emerged, but the strongest was Philip II of Spain, who was the son of a Portuguese princess and had both legal claim and, more importantly, military power. In 1580, Spanish armies crossed the border. Some Portuguese resisted, but the cause was hopeless. Portugal, after nearly 200 years of hard-won independence, after building a global empire, after achieving greatness that far exceeded its size, fell under Spanish rule. The 2 crowns would remain united for 60 years, a period called the Iberian Union. Portugal maintained its own laws and administration. Its overseas territories remained theoretically Portuguese, but the king in Madrid made the ultimate decisions. For a proud nation that had fought so hard for independence, it was a bitter pill. Yet even in this darkest hour, Portugal's empire endured, and the Portuguese spirit, resilient, stubborn, dreaming always of the sea, remained unbroken. The 60 years of Spanish rule, from 1580 to 1640, were a time of contradiction for Portugal. On one hand, the Union brought Portugal into Spain's vast global conflicts. Spain was at war with the Dutch Republic, with England, with France at various times, and these enemies made no distinction between Spanish and Portuguese possessions. Dutch and English privateers and warships attacked Portuguese colonies and trading posts from Brazil to the East Indies. The Dutch, in particular, newly independent and fiercely Protestant, were building their own maritime empire and saw Portuguese holdings as legitimate targets. In 1595, the first Dutch fleet sailed to the East Indies, and over the following decades, the Dutch systematically attacked Portuguese positions, capturing Malacca in 1641, driving the Portuguese from Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka, taking control of the lucrative spice trade that Portugal had once monopolized. Yet the union with Spain also brought certain advantages. Portuguese merchants could trade freely throughout Spain's vast American empire. The administrative apparatus of Portugal's empire continued to function. Portuguese governors ruled Goa. Portuguese captains commanded fleets. Portuguese Jesuits continued their missionary work in Japan, China, and Brazil. Brazil, in particular, began to emerge from obscurity during this period. Sugar cultivation, using enslaved African labor, transformed the northeastern coast into a profitable enterprise. Salvador de Bahia became a thriving colonial capital. The Portuguese language, Portuguese law, and Portuguese culture took deep root in this vast territory. Brazil was becoming more than a trading post. It was becoming a colony in the truest sense, a new Portugal across the ocean. Throughout these decades of Spanish rule, resentment simmered in Portugal. The Portuguese nobility chafed under Spanish administration. Merchants resented bearing the costs of Spain's endless wars. The common people remembered independence, remembered their own kings. Popular prophecies spoke of Sebastianism, the belief that young King Sebastio had not truly died at Alcácer, but would return as a messianic figure to restore Portugal's glory. It was a myth born of desperation and longing, but it kept alive the dream of independence. And that dream found concrete form in a conspiracy among Portuguese nobles who believed the time had come to throw off Spanish rule. On December 1st, 1640, a group of conspirators, led by the Duke of Braganza João, staged a coup in Lisbon. It was remarkably bloodless. The plotters entered the royal palace, killed the Spanish Secretary of State, and arrested the Spanish governor. They proclaimed the Duke of Braganza as King João IV of Portugal. The restoration happened so swiftly, with such careful planning and such broad support among the Portuguese nobility, that Spain was caught entirely off guard. Spain was exhausted by the 30 Years' War raging in Central Europe and by rebellion in Catalonia. It could not immediately crush the Portuguese uprising. João IV quickly secured recognition from France and England, both rivals of Spain, and organized Portugal's defences. What followed was the Portuguese Restoration War, which lasted 28 years until 1668. It was not a continuous conflict, but a series of campaigns, border skirmishes, and occasional major battles. Spain was the far larger power, but Portugal had allies, defensible borders, and the determination of a people fighting for their existence. The war was primarily fought along the frontier between Portugal and Spain, a landscape of fortified towns and strategic positions. Portuguese commanders, often using French military advisers and tactics, defended stubbornly. Key battles like the Battle of Montijo in 1644 and the Battle of Ameixial in 1663 ended in Portuguese victories, demonstrating that Spain could not simply overwhelm its smaller neighbour through force. The war dragged on, year after year, neither side able to achieve decisive victory, both exhausted by the cost. Finally, in 1668, Spain formally recognized Portuguese independence through the Treaty of Lisbon. Spain, facing threats on multiple fronts in Europe, concluded that Portugal could not be reconquered at acceptable cost. João IV had died in 1656, but his son Afonso VI, and then his brother Pedro II, continued the fight. With the treaty, Portugal was once again a sovereign kingdom. The restoration was complete. The House of Braganza, which would rule Portugal for the next 2.5 centuries until the end of the monarchy, was secure on the throne. Portugal had survived its greatest crisis since the Castilian invasions of the 14th century. The nation had endured. But the Portugal that emerged from the Restoration War was changed, diminished. Much of the Asian Empire was gone. The Dutch controlled the spice trade. The English were expanding in India. The Japanese had expelled all Portuguese traders and missionaries in the 1630s, brutally persecuting Japanese Christians in a campaign of martyrdom that ended centuries of Portuguese presence. What remained of Portugal's empire was primarily Atlantic, Brazil, which was growing in importance, and trading posts along the African coasts, particularly Angola and Mozambique, which had become essential to the slave trade that fueled Brazilian sugar plantations. Portugal's age of maritime supremacy was over, but it remained a colonial power, and Brazil would prove to be its most valuable possession. The late 17th century brought economic recovery and new sources of wealth. In the 1690s, gold was discovered in the interior of Brazil, in the region that would become Minas Gerais, General Mines. It was one of the greatest gold strikes in history. Prospectors and fortune-seekers flooded into the Brazilian interior, establishing mining towns in previously unexplored territory. Indigenous peoples were displaced or enslaved alongside African slaves who were forced to work the mines. The gold flowed back to Lisbon in astonishing quantities. King Pedro II and his successor João V suddenly commanded wealth that dwarfed the spice trade of earlier centuries. Portugal, which had been nearly bankrupted by the Restoration War, was now rich again, not through its own industry or agriculture, but through the exploitation of Brazilian resources and enslaved labor. King João V, who reigned from 1706 to 1750, used this wealth to make Portugal magnificent once more. He was called the Magnanimous, and he lived up to the name through extravagant patronage. He commissioned the construction of the Palace Convent of Mafra, an enormous complex that combined royal palace, monastery, and basilica, one of the most ambitious architectural projects in 18th-century Europe. It required thousands of workers, Italian architects and sculptors, vast quantities of marble and exotic woods. The library at Mafra, with its vaulted ceiling and rococo decoration, housing tens of thousands of books, stands as one of the most beautiful libraries in the world. João V also invested heavily in the arts, in learning, in making Lisbon a cosmopolitan capital. He sent gold to Rome, contributing to the building of churches, earning papal favor and decorations. Portugal under João V projected an image of power and culture that belied its relatively small size and recent near-destruction. Yet beneath the surface, problems festered. The economy was fundamentally imbalanced. Portugal was consuming Brazilian gold without developing its own industries or agriculture. The gold enriched the king and nobility, but didn't transform Portuguese society in lasting ways. Most of the population remained poor, illiterate, tied to the land in semi-feudal relationships. The church was immensely powerful, controlling vast estates and much of education. The Inquisition, established in Portugal in 1536, continued to operate, though less viciously than in earlier times, but still creating an atmosphere of religious conformity and suspicion. Jews who had converted to Christianity, called New Christians or conversos, faced ongoing discrimination and suspicion. Portugal was wealthy but not productive, magnificent but not innovative, stable but not dynamic. And change, dramatic and devastating change, was coming, though no one in the calm days of the early 1750s could have anticipated just how sudden and complete that change would be. The morning of November 1st, 1755, was All Saints' Day, one of the most important religious festivals in the Catholic calendar. Churches throughout Lisbon were filled with worshippers attending morning mass, candles flickering before altars, voices raised in prayer. The city was at peace, going about its sacred rituals, when suddenly, at approximately 9:40 in the morning, the earth began to shake. The Great Lisbon Earthquake, one of the most powerful seismic events in European history, struck with devastating force. Modern estimates place its magnitude between 8.5 and 9.0. The shaking lasted for several terrifying minutes. Buildings swayed, then collapsed. Churches, with their high stone walls and heavy roofs, became death traps, crushing the congregations inside. The royal palace by the river crumbled. Entire neighborhoods fell into rubble and dust. But the earthquake was only the beginning. Survivors stumbling from the ruins noticed something strange. The Tagus River was receding, pulling back from the shore, exposing the river bottom. Then the tsunami came. 3 massive waves, generated by the undersea earthquake, struck Lisbon's waterfront. The waves reached heights of perhaps 15 to 20 meters, surging inland, sweeping away everything in their path. Ships in the harbor were lifted and smashed against buildings. People who had fled to the open spaces near the river were drowned. The lower parts of the city were inundated. And then came fire. The earthquake had struck during the morning when cooking fires and church candles were lit. Flames erupted across the ruined city, spreading from building to building, consuming what the earthquake and tsunami had spared. The fire burned for days, turning Lisbon into an inferno. When it was over, when the flames finally died and the survivors could take stock, the devastation was almost incomprehensible. Estimates suggest that between 30,000 and 60,000 people died, out of a population of around 200,000. Roughly 85% of Lisbon's buildings were destroyed. Churches, palaces, libraries, archives, centuries of accumulated culture and history, were gone. The Royal Library, one of the finest in Europe, was consumed by fire. Priceless manuscripts, artworks, records of the Age of Discovery, all turned to ash. The earthquake was felt across Europe and North Africa, and the tsunami reached as far as the Caribbean. But Lisbon bore the brunt of nature's fury. It was one of the worst natural disasters in European history, and it raised profound theological and philosophical questions. Why would God destroy a devout Catholic city on a holy day? The earthquake shook not just buildings but certainties, contributing to Enlightenment debates about divine providence, natural law, and human suffering. In the aftermath of the catastrophe, one man emerged to take control of the recovery, Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, better known as the Marquis of Pombal. Pombal was serving as King José I's chief minister, and he responded to the crisis with remarkable speed and decisiveness. When the king, traumatized by the earthquake, asked what should be done, Pombal reportedly replied, "Bury the dead and feed the living." He immediately organized relief efforts, preventing disease from spreading through the corpse-filled ruins, ensuring food supplies reached survivors, maintaining order and preventing looting. Then came the monumental task of rebuilding. Pombal envisioned not just reconstruction but transformation, a new Lisbon, planned rationally, built to resist future earthquakes, embodying Enlightenment ideals of order and reason. The reconstruction of Lisbon's downtown, called the Baixa, became one of the first examples of large-scale earthquake-resistant construction and rational urban planning. Engineers developed new building techniques, wooden cage structures within stone walls that could flex during tremors, streets laid out in a grid pattern for ease of movement and firefighting, standardized building heights and facades creating visual harmony. The Baixa that arose from the ruins was different from the medieval tangle it had replaced. It was orderly, elegant, functional. The rebuilding took decades, but when complete, it stood as testament to human ingenuity and resilience. Walking through Lisbon's Baixa today, with its perpendicular streets and neoclassical buildings, you're walking through Pombal's vision, a city literally rebuilt from catastrophe. Pombal used the crisis to consolidate his own power and to push through sweeping reforms. He was a controversial figure, enlightened despot, ruthless modernizer, depending on one's perspective. He worked to reduce the power of the nobility and especially the church. In 1759, Pombal expelled the Jesuits from Portugal and all its territories, seizing their properties and assets. The Jesuits had been influential in education and in the colonies, particularly Brazil, where they had established missions among indigenous peoples. Pombal accused them of excessive independence, of creating a state within a state. The expulsion was brutal and sudden, and it signaled that the old order was changing. Pombal also reformed education, taking it out of exclusive church control and establishing state-run schools. He abolished slavery in mainland Portugal in 1761, though not in the colonies, where enslaved labor remained fundamental to the economy. He promoted commerce and manufacturing, trying to make Portugal less dependent on Brazilian gold and more economically self-sufficient. Pombal's reforms were genuine attempts at modernization, but his methods were authoritarian. He suppressed opposition ruthlessly. When members of the Tavora family and other nobles were implicated in an alleged assassination attempt against King José I in 1758, Pombal used the opportunity to crush aristocratic resistance. The Tavoras and their associates were arrested, tortured, and publicly executed in a gruesome spectacle designed to terrorize potential opponents. Whether the assassination plot was real or manufactured remains debated, but the result was clear. Pombal's power became nearly absolute, and the old nobility was cowed. Portugal was being dragged into the Enlightenment, but not gently. The late 18th century brought new challenges to Portugal's colonial empire. Great Britain, with whom Portugal had maintained its ancient alliance, was becoming the dominant world power, industrializing, expanding its own empire. Portugal found itself increasingly in Britain's shadow, economically dependent on British trade and diplomatically reliant on British support. The Methuen Treaty of 1703 had already established favourable terms for British textiles in Portugal in exchange for Portuguese wine exports to Britain. Port wine from the Douro Valley became a British staple, but the relationship was increasingly unequal. Portugal was becoming something close to a British protectorate in economic terms, though officially independent. When King Jose I died in 1777, his daughter became Queen Maria I, Portugal's first undisputed queen regnant. She immediately dismissed Pombal, who had made too many enemies among the nobility and clergy. Many of his reforms were rolled back, though some endured. Maria I was pious and conservative, restoring church influence and noble privileges. But she faced mounting personal and political difficulties. The French Revolution erupted in 1789, sending shock waves across Europe. Monarchies everywhere watched in horror as France descended into revolution, regicide, and terror. Portugal, small and Catholic and conservative, had every reason to fear revolutionary contagion, and Maria I's own mental health deteriorated. By the late 1790s, she was suffering from what was probably severe depression and mental illness, unable to govern effectively. In 1799, her son João assumed power as Prince Regent, taking control of the kingdom as his mother descended into darkness. Portugal stood at the threshold of a new century, but the old certainties were crumbling. Revolutionary France was transforming into Napoleonic France, and Napoleon Bonaparte was reshaping Europe through conquest and war. Portugal's alliance with Britain would soon drag it into this continental conflict. The comfortable world of the 18th century, where Portugal could maintain its empire and its independence through careful diplomacy and British friendship, was about to be shattered. The small kingdom would face its greatest threat since the Spanish annexation, and this time the enemy would be the most powerful military force Europe had ever seen. Storm clouds were gathering, and Portugal stood directly in their path. Napoleon Bonaparte had conquered much of Europe by the early 1800s, and his continental system demanded that all European nations cease trade with Britain, his most persistent enemy. Portugal faced an impossible dilemma. The ancient alliance with Britain was the cornerstone of Portuguese foreign policy and economic survival. British protection had guaranteed Portuguese independence. British markets consumed Portuguese wine. British ships defended Portuguese colonies. But defying Napoleon meant inviting invasion from the most powerful army Europe had ever known. Prince Regent João tried to navigate between these two forces, maintaining official neutrality while quietly continuing trade with Britain. Napoleon's patience ran out. In 1807, he issued an ultimatum, close your ports to British ships or face invasion. When Portugal refused to completely sever ties with Britain, Napoleon acted. In October 1807, a French army under General Junot, accompanied by Spanish forces, marched toward Lisbon. The Portuguese royal family faced a decision unprecedented in European history. Rather than stay and submit to French occupation or flee into exile in some other European court, Prince João made a bold choice. The entire royal family, the court, the government, thousands of nobles, officials, clergy, and servants would evacuate to Brazil. It was an audacious plan, and it was executed in desperate haste. In late November 1807, as French troops approached the outskirts of Lisbon, a fleet of Portuguese ships carrying approximately 10,000 to 15,000 people, including Prince João, his mother Queen Maria I, the royal archives, the treasury, and the apparatus of government, set sail across the Atlantic under British naval escort. General Junot entered Lisbon on November 30th, 1807, just days after the fleet departed. He found the city intact, but its rulers gone, fled to the other side of the world. It was extraordinary. No European monarch had ever relocated their entire government to a colony before. The journey to Brazil took nearly 2 months, and conditions on the overcrowded ships were difficult, but in January 1808, the Portuguese court arrived in Rio de Janeiro. For the first time in history, a European capital was located outside Europe. Rio de Janeiro, which had been a colonial city, suddenly became the seat of the Portuguese Empire. João opened Brazilian ports to international trade, primarily benefiting Britain, established courts, a central bank, libraries, theatres, bringing European institutions and culture to Brazil. The colony was being transformed into something more, a kingdom in its own right. Meanwhile, Portugal itself endured French occupation. Junot's forces imposed heavy taxation, requisitioned supplies, and attempted to integrate Portugal into Napoleon's European system. But the Portuguese people, though their rulers had departed, did not submit quietly. In June 1808, uprisings began in Porto and spread across the north. The Spanish people had also risen against French occupation in what became the Peninsular War, and Portugal became a crucial theatre of this larger conflict. Britain, seeing an opportunity to strike at Napoleon through Iberia, sent an expeditionary force under Sir Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, to support Portuguese resistance. Portuguese and British forces fought side by side against repeated French invasions. The Peninsular War in Portugal lasted from 1808 to 1814 and consisted of 3 major French invasions. The first invasion under Junot was expelled by British and Portuguese forces in 1808. The second invasion in 1809 under Marshal Soult reached Porto, but was driven back. The third invasion in 1810 under Marshal Massena penetrated deepest, approaching Lisbon, but encountered the lines of Torres Vedras, an extensive system of fortifications north of Lisbon, planned by Wellington and built by the Portuguese, consisting of 152 forts and redoubts stretching across hills and valleys. The French army, unable to break through, and with Portuguese forces employing scorched-earth tactics, destroying crops and supplies to deny them to the enemy, was forced to retreat. The lines of Torres Vedras proved to be an effective defensive strategy, and by 1811 Portugal was largely cleared of French forces. The war devastated Portugal. Fields were trampled, villages burned, crops destroyed. The population suffered terribly from requisitions, violence, and hunger. Tens of thousands died, soldiers in battle, civilians from starvation and disease. Yet Portugal survived, its independence preserved through British military assistance and Portuguese popular resistance. The guerrilla warfare, ambushes, sabotage, harassment of French supply lines, demonstrated that even a small nation could make occupation unbearably costly for a great power. When Napoleon finally fell in 1814, defeated by the coalitions of European powers, Portugal was on the winning side, its sovereignty intact. But the kingdom had been profoundly altered by the experience. The constitutional and liberal ideas that had emerged from the French Revolution, despite being associated with the enemy, had nonetheless taken root in Portuguese minds. Many Portuguese who had fought alongside British forces, who had witnessed different forms of government, who had seen traditional monarchical authority challenged, began to question Portugal's own absolutist system. In 1820, while King João VI, João had assumed the title when his mother died in 1816, remained in Brazil, a liberal revolution erupted in Porto. Military officers and urban middle classes demanded a constitutional monarchy, representative government, limits on royal power. The revolutionaries convened a Cortes to write a constitution. It was Portugal's own echo of the age of revolutions that had transformed America, France, and much of Latin America. King João VI found himself in an impossible position. If he stayed in Brazil, he risked losing Portugal to liberals who might abolish the monarchy or place his son on the throne. If he returned to Portugal, he might lose Brazil, which had grown accustomed to being the centre of the empire and had no desire to return to colonial status. In 1821, João made his choice. He returned to Portugal, leaving his eldest son Pedro in Brazil as Prince Regent with instructions to maintain Portuguese authority. João arrived in Lisbon to find a constitutional monarchy. He was forced to swear an oath to the new constitution of 1822, which established a parliamentary system, limited royal power, and guaranteed certain civil liberties. It was a dramatic transformation for a nation that had been ruled by absolute monarchs for centuries. But the constitutional arrangement satisfied neither conservative royalists, who saw it as radical and dangerous, nor more radical liberals, who thought it didn't go far enough. And Brazil, as João had feared, refused to return to subordinate colonial status. In 1822, Prince Pedro, responding to Brazilian demands and defying orders from Lisbon to return to Portugal, declared Brazilian independence. On September 7, 1822, on the banks of the Ipiranga River, Pedro reportedly tore the Portuguese colours from his uniform and shouted, "Independence or death." He became Emperor Pedro I of an independent Brazil. Portugal had lost its largest, richest, most important colony, the colony that had sustained the empire economically for over a century. The loss of Brazil was a wound from which the Portuguese Empire would never fully recover. Portugal was suddenly a small European nation with scattered African and Asian possessions, no longer a great power even by courtesy. The years following Brazilian independence brought political instability to Portugal. King João VI tried to navigate between liberal and conservative factions, satisfying neither. When he died in 1826, succession disputes plunged the country into civil war. João's eldest son Pedro had become Emperor of Brazil and couldn't easily abandon that throne, while João's younger son Miguel represented absolutist, conservative interests. The question of who should rule Portugal, and under what system, constitutional monarchy or absolute monarchy, would be settled only through conflict. Portugal in the 1820s and 1830s was a nation exhausted by war, diminished by loss, divided over its future, struggling to find its place in a rapidly changing world. Yet through all these trials, Portugal endured. The nation that had survived Roman conquest, Muslim invasion, Spanish annexation, and Napoleonic occupation would find a way forward, however uncertain the path. The succession crisis that followed King João VI's death in 1826 plunged Portugal into civil war, a conflict that would define Portuguese politics for a generation. Pedro, who had become Emperor of Brazil, briefly inherited the Portuguese throne as Pedro IV, but quickly abdicated in favor of his young daughter Maria de Gloria, who was just 7 years old. Pedro issued a constitutional charter, a more moderate document than the liberal constitution of 1822, attempting to balance royal authority with representative government. But Pedro's younger brother Miguel, who had been serving as regent, refused to accept this arrangement. In 1828, Miguel staged a coup, dissolved the constitutional government, and had himself proclaimed absolute monarch as Miguel I, with support from conservative nobles, much of the clergy, and rural populations who distrusted liberal reforms. What followed was the Liberal Wars, also called the War of the Two Brothers, lasting from 1828 to 1834. Portugal was split between Miguelites, who supported absolute monarchy and traditional Catholic authority, and liberals, who supported constitutional government and young Queen Maria II. It was both a dynastic struggle and an ideological civil war, mirroring conflicts happening across Europe between conservative and liberal forces. Pedro, having abdicated the Brazilian throne in favor of his son in 1831, returned to Europe to fight for his daughter's rights. In 1832, liberal forces under Pedro landed at Mindelo near Porto and took the city after a siege. For over a year, Porto was surrounded by Miguelite forces in one of the war's longest and most brutal episodes, the Siege of Porto from 1832 to 1833, where starvation and disease claimed thousands of lives. The tide turned when liberal forces, aided by British and French support, both nations favouring constitutional government over absolutism, landed in the Algarve and marched north. In 1834, the final decisive battle occurred at Alseep, where liberal forces defeated Miguel's army. Miguel was forced to surrender and went into exile. Young Maria II was restored to the throne, and Portugal became definitively a constitutional monarchy. Pedro died shortly after, exhausted by the struggle, but he had secured his daughter's throne and Portugal's liberal future. The constitutional charter he had issued, with some modifications, would govern Portugal for decades. Yet the divisions opened by the Civil War, between liberals and conservatives, urban and rural, modernizers and traditionalists, would continue to shape Portuguese politics throughout the 19th century. The mid-19th century brought relative stability, but also stark awareness of Portugal's diminished status. Portugal was now a small, poor, peripheral nation in a Europe increasingly dominated by industrializing powers like Britain, France, and a newly unified Germany. Portuguese governments struggled with chronic financial difficulties, unable to raise sufficient revenue to modernize infrastructure or develop industry. Agriculture remained the backbone of the economy, but agricultural methods were often antiquated. Literacy rates were among the lowest in Western Europe. The country had glorious history but uncertain prospects. Yet there was one arena where Portugal still possessed significant holdings: Africa. As the 19th century progressed, European powers engaged in what became known as the scramble for Africa, competing to claim African territories. Portugal held ancient coastal enclaves in Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, and São Tomé and Príncipe, remnants of the Age of Discovery. Now Portugal sought to expand these footholds into substantial colonial territories. Portuguese explorers and military expeditions pushed into the African interior. In the 1870s and 1880s, Portugal claimed vast territories in Angola and Mozambique, far beyond the coastal trading posts it had maintained for centuries. Portuguese ambitions included connecting Angola on the Atlantic coast to Mozambique on the Indian Ocean, the so-called Pink Map, showing Portuguese territorial claims across southern Africa. But Portugal's African ambitions collided with those of Britain, particularly the vision of Cecil Rhodes and others who wanted to build a continuous British corridor from Cape Town to Cairo. In 1890, Britain delivered an ultimatum to Portugal demanding withdrawal from territories in what is now Zimbabwe and Zambia that Portugal claimed but barely controlled. Britain had superior military and economic power, and Portugal, unable to resist, was forced to comply. The British ultimatum of 1890 was a national humiliation for Portugal. Public outcry was immense. Demonstrations filled Lisbon's streets. The government fell. Republican sentiment surged. The monarchy, which had survived civil war and constitutional struggles, was now blamed for national weakness and submission to foreign powers. The ultimatum revealed Portugal's vulnerability and accelerated the erosion of monarchical legitimacy. Despite the setback, Portugal retained substantial African colonies in Angola and Mozambique, territories many times larger than Portugal itself. Colonial administrators, settlers, and soldiers worked to impose Portuguese authority over diverse African populations who had their own kingdoms, cultures, and ways of life. The colonial project was justified through claims of a civilizing mission, but the reality was often harsh: forced labor, brutal suppression of resistance, extraction of resources. The colonies provided some economic benefits to Portugal, but also represented a drain on limited resources and a moral burden that would eventually contribute to Portugal's later political crises. While politically troubled, Portugal in the late 19th century experienced cultural vitality. The period saw a flowering of Portuguese literature. Writers like Enchanted de Queiroz produced novels that critically examined Portuguese society with realism and irony. artists, poets, and intellectuals gathered in Lisbon cafes, debating politics, philosophy, and Portugal's place in the modern world. In 1879, Portugal abolished the death penalty for civil crimes, becoming one of the first countries in the world to do so, a progressive step that reflected liberal influences. Infrastructure slowly improved. Railroads connected major cities, telegraph lines were established, gaslighting appeared in Lisbon and Porto. Yet progress was uneven, concentrated in cities, while much of the rural population remained isolated and poor. By the turn of the 20th century, the Portuguese monarchy faced mounting challenges. King Carlos I, who reigned from 1889 to 1908, struggled with financial crises, political instability, and growing republican sentiment. The monarchy was seen as corrupt, inefficient, and out of touch. Republican parties gained strength, drawing support from urban middle classes, intellectuals, military officers, and workers. The monarchy responded with increasing authoritarianism. In 1906, King Carlos appointed João Franco as prime minister with dictatorial powers to restore order and reform finances. Franco's dictatorship suppressed civil liberties and dissolved parliament, further alienating the population. On February 1, 1908, tragedy struck the royal family in the heart of Lisbon. King Carlos and his family were returning from their palace at Vila Viçosa, riding in an open carriage through the Terreiro do Poco, the grand square by the Tagus River. Suddenly, assassins emerged from the crowd and opened fire. King Carlos was killed instantly. His eldest son and heir, Prince Luís Felipe, was mortally wounded and died minutes later. The younger son, Manuel, was injured but survived. It was a shocking act of political violence that traumatized the nation. The assassins were Republicans, motivated by hatred of the monarchy and dictatorship. The 18-year-old Manuel became King Manuel II, the last king of Portugal, inheriting a throne that was already crumbling. Manuel II was well-meaning but inexperienced, and he faced an impossible task. Republican sentiment was now overwhelming, especially after the martyrdom created by the assassinations paradoxically failed to generate sympathy for the monarchy. Republican conspiracies flourished in the military and among civilians. On October 4, 1910, Republican forces, including disaffected military units, rose in revolt in Lisbon. Fighting lasted only 2 days. The monarchy, with little popular support and facing armed rebellion, collapsed. On October 5, 1910, the Portuguese Republic was proclaimed from the balcony of Lisbon's City Hall. Manuel too fled into exile in Britain, where he would live the rest of his life. After 771 years of monarchy, from Afonso Henriques to Manuel II, Portugal had become a republic. It was the end of an era, a fundamental rupture with centuries of tradition. The Republican flag, with its green and red bands replacing the royal blue and white, was raised across the nation. A new chapter in Portuguese history had begun, though few could have predicted how turbulent it would prove to be. The first Portuguese Republic, born with such hope in 1910, quickly descended into chaos. The Republicans who had overthrown the monarchy were united in what they opposed, but deeply divided over what should replace it. The new government was dominated by the Portuguese Republican Party, which pursued an aggressively secular and anti-clerical agenda. In 1911, a new constitution established a parliamentary system with a powerful legislature and a weak presidency. But the constitution could not create the stability that Portugal desperately needed. Between 1910 and 1926, Portugal experienced 45 different governments, an average of one government every 4 months. Cabinets rose and fell with bewildering speed. Prime ministers came and went. Parliament was paralyzed by factionalism. The Republic, which was meant to bring progress and stability, instead brought political fragmentation. The Republic's anti-clericalism alienated large portions of the population, particularly in rural areas where the Catholic Church remained deeply influential. In 1911, the law of separation officially separated church and state, expelled religious orders, seized church property, and removed religious instruction from schools. These measures were radical by Portuguese standards and created deep resentment among conservative and religious populations. Meanwhile, monarchist conspiracies persisted. Several attempted coups sought to restore the monarchy, most notably an incursion in 1912, when royalist forces briefly occupied parts of northern Portugal before being defeated. The Republic faced enemies on both the right, from monarchists and Catholics, and eventually on the left, from anarchists and radical workers who felt the Republic had not gone far enough in addressing social inequality. Then came the Great War. When World War I erupted in August 1914, Portugal initially declared neutrality. The nation was poor, politically unstable, militarily weak, and had no desire to be drawn into Europe's catastrophic conflict. But Portugal's situation was complicated by the ancient alliance with Britain and by colonial considerations. Germany had colonies in Africa adjacent to Portuguese Angola and Mozambique, and there were fears that Germany might seize Portuguese territories or that Britain might occupy them for protection if Portugal seemed too weak or too neutral. Under pressure from Britain and from interventionist factions within Portugal, who saw the war as an opportunity to gain international prestige and secure colonial holdings, Portugal entered the war on the Allied side in 1916. Portuguese entry into World War I was a disaster for a nation already struggling. Portugal sent an expeditionary force, the Portuguese Expeditionary Corps, to fight on the Western Front in France and Flanders, eventually numbering about 55,000 men. These soldiers fought bravely in the trenches, enduring the same horrors as British, French, and German troops: mud, poison gas, artillery barrages, machine gun fire. On April 9, 1918, during the German Spring Offensive, Portuguese forces holding a section of the line near Lollis River in Flanders were hit by a massive German assault. The Battle of Lollis was devastating. Portuguese units were overrun. Thousands were killed, wounded, or captured. Of the approximately 20,000 Portuguese soldiers in the sector, about 7,500 became casualties. It was Portugal's bloodiest day of the war, and the defeat shattered what remained of Portuguese military morale. Portugal also fought in Africa, defending its colonial territories against German forces from neighboring colonies. These campaigns in Angola and Mozambique were harsh, fought in difficult terrain against both German and local resistance. When the war ended in November 1918 with Allied victory, Portugal was on the winning side, but the victory felt hollow. Thousands of Portuguese soldiers had died. The economy was devastated by war expenditures. Inflation had soared, and food shortages plagued cities. The promised gains, international prestige, secure colonies, seemed inadequate compensation for the suffering. The war discredited the Republican government further, seen as having dragged Portugal into a conflict that brought only loss. Political instability intensified in the war's aftermath. The immediate post-war years brought social upheaval. Workers struck for better wages and conditions as inflation eroded their living standards. In 1918 and 1919, a wave of strikes swept Lisbon and other cities. Transport workers, dockers, factory workers. Some strikes turned violent, with confrontations between workers and police. Anarchist and syndicalist movements gained influence among urban workers, advocating for revolutionary change. Simultaneously, right-wing movements emerged, drawing support from military officers, businessmen, and conservatives alarmed by social disorder and perceived communist threats. Though Portuguese communism was still nascent, the Russian Revolution of 1917 had sent shockwaves through Europe, and many feared similar uprisings. Portugal seemed to be fracturing, caught between revolutionary left and reactionary right, with a weak Republican centre unable to maintain control. In 1917, in the midst of war and crisis, something extraordinary happened in the small town of Fátima in central Portugal. 3 peasant children reported seeing apparitions of the Virgin Mary, who allegedly delivered messages about prayer, penance, and the conversion of Russia. The Fátima apparitions, occurring between May and October 1917, attracted growing crowds despite initial skepticism from church and civil authorities. The final apparition on October 13th was witnessed by tens of thousands who reported seeing the sun appear to dance in the sky, an event unexplained by science, interpreted by believers as a miracle. Fátima would become one of the most important Catholic pilgrimage sites in the world, eventually drawing millions of pilgrims. For Portugal, Fátima represented a complex counterpoint to the secularizing republic, a resurgence of popular religious faith at precisely the moment when the Republican government was trying to diminish the Church's influence. The chaos finally reached a breaking point. On May 28, 1926, General Manuel Gomes da Costa led a military coup that began in Braga and quickly gained support across the country. The First Republic, exhausted and discredited, collapsed without significant resistance. The coup marked the beginning of a military dictatorship that would soon evolve into something more systematic and enduring. Initially, a military junta governed, but internal conflicts among the generals created continued instability. What Portugal needed, many believed, was not just military rule, but a complete reorganization of the state, a new system that could provide the order and stability that democracy had failed to deliver. That system, and the man who would embody it, was about to emerge. In 1928, the military government appointed Antonio de Oliveira Salazar as Minister of Finance. Salazar was an economics professor from Coimbra University, a devout Catholic, conservative, austere, and possessed of a clear authoritarian vision. He agreed to take the position only on the condition that he would have complete control over all government finances. All ministries would have to submit their budgets to him for approval. The military, desperate for someone who could stabilize the economy and restore financial order, agreed to his terms. It was a decision that would shape Portugal for the next half-century. Salazar balanced the budget through severe spending cuts and rigid financial controls. His success gave him immense credibility and power. Within a few years, he would become not just finance minister but effective dictator of Portugal, establishing an authoritarian regime called the Estado Novo, the new state, that would endure longer than almost any other dictatorship in 20th-century Europe. The age of the Republic's chaotic democracy was over. The long night of dictatorship was beginning. In 1932, António de Oliveira Salazar was appointed Prime Minister of Portugal, a position he would hold for the next 36 years. One of the longest ruling dictators in modern European history. Salazar was not a charismatic leader in the mold of Mussolini or Hitler. He was quiet, methodical, professorial, more accountant than demagogue. He rarely appeared in public, gave few speeches, and cultivated an image of the selfless technocrat sacrificing himself for national salvation. In 1933, he promulgated a new constitution establishing the Estado Novo, the new state, an authoritarian corporatist regime that would govern Portugal until 1974. The Estado Novo was officially not a dictatorship but an organic democracy, with a single party, the National Union, and institutions designed to represent different sectors of society, workers, employers, professionals, within a controlled framework. In reality, it was a dictatorship, with Salazar holding ultimate authority over all aspects of government. The Estado Novo was deeply conservative, Catholic, nationalist, and ruralist in its ideology. Salazar promoted traditional values, God, fatherland, family, as the pillars of Portuguese society. The Church regained much of the influence it had lost under the Republic. In 1940, a concordat with the Vatican regulated church-state relations, giving the Church control over marriage law and religious education. Salazar envisioned Portugal as a rural, agrarian nation of small farmers and traditional communities, suspicious of urbanization and industrialization, which he associated with the social disorder and radicalism that had plagued the Republic. He enforced strict censorship through the regime's secret police, initially called the PVDE and later reorganized as the PIDE, the International and State Defense Police, which monitored, arrested, and tortured political dissidents. Opposition parties were banned, strikes were illegal, and independent trade unions were suppressed. When the Spanish Civil War erupted in 1936, pitting Francisco Franco's nationalists against the Republican government, Salazar quietly supported Franco's forces. The war next door reinforced Salazar's conviction that leftist politics led to chaos and destruction. Portugal officially remained neutral, but allowed Franco's forces to use Portuguese territory and provided diplomatic support. Franco's eventual victory in 1939 resulted in a fascist dictatorship on Portugal's border. The two Iberian dictatorships would maintain friendly relations throughout their existence, united by ideology and mutual interest in suppressing opposition. When World War II began in September 1939, Portugal again declared neutrality, as it had initially in World War I. But this time, Salazar maintained that neutrality throughout the entire war, a remarkable diplomatic achievement. Portugal was strategically important, controlling access to the Atlantic and sitting between belligerent nations. Both the Allies and the Axis powers wanted Portuguese cooperation, or at least benevolent neutrality. Salazar navigated carefully, maintaining the ancient alliance with Britain while avoiding antagonizing Nazi Germany. He sold tungsten, essential for armor-piercing ammunition, to both sides, profiting from the war while keeping Portugal out of it. In 1943, under pressure from Britain and the United States, Salazar allowed the Allies to establish military bases in the Azores, a crucial mid-Atlantic location for anti-submarine warfare and air operations. This cooperation helped the Allied cause without requiring Portugal to formally enter the war. Portugal's neutrality meant it escaped the devastation that consumed much of Europe. While cities across the continent were bombed to rubble and millions died in combat and Holocaust, Portugal remained at peace. Lisbon became a refuge for those fleeing the war, exiled governments, refugees, spies from all sides, Jews escaping Nazi persecution. The Portuguese consul in Bordeaux, Aristides de Sousa Mendes, defied Salazar's orders in June 1940 and issued thousands of visas to refugees, including many Jews, allowing them to escape through Portugal to safety, an act of humanitarian courage that cost him his career and livelihood. Salazar stripped him of his position and pension, but Sousa Mendes had saved countless lives. After the war, Portugal was admitted to the United Nations in 1955, and the regime gained a degree of international legitimacy, despite its authoritarian nature, particularly as the Cold War made anti-communist dictatorships useful allies to the West. The Estado Novo clung tenaciously to Portugal's African colonies, Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, São Tomé and Príncipe, as well as small possessions in Asia like Goa, Macau, and East Timor. While other European powers began decolonizing after World War II, Britain granted independence to India in 1947, France lost Indochina and would lose Algeria. Portugal refused to follow. Salazar insisted that Portugal's colonies were not colonies at all but overseas provinces, integral parts of Portugal itself. The official ideology promoted lusotropicalism, the notion that Portuguese colonialism was uniquely benign, creating multiracial societies where Portuguese and Africans lived in harmony. This was propaganda masking a brutal reality: forced labor, racial discrimination, denial of political rights, violent suppression of dissent. The colonies were economically important to Portugal, providing cheap raw materials and captive markets, and psychologically important as proof that Portugal was still a great power, still relevant on the world stage. In 1961, that colonial edifice began to crack. India, independent since 1947 and increasingly assertive, demanded that Portugal hand over its Indian territories. When Portugal refused, Indian forces invaded and quickly overwhelmed the small Portuguese garrisons. On December 18th and 19th, 1961, Goa, Daman, and Diu were annexed by India, ending over 450 years of Portuguese presence on the Indian subcontinent. Salazar was humiliated but powerless. Portugal could not project military force to defend distant enclaves against a nation of India's size. The loss of Goa was a symbolic blow, but far worse was coming. Just months earlier, in February 1961, armed rebellion had erupted in Angola. The MPLA, the People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola, attacked colonial targets in Luanda. In March, another rebellion began in northern Angola, with the UPA, Union of Angolan Peoples, massacring Portuguese settlers and African workers on coffee plantations, to which Portuguese forces responded with brutal reprisals, killing thousands of Africans. These uprisings marked the beginning of the Portuguese colonial war, which would drag on for 13 years across 3 fronts: Angola, Guinea-Bissau, and Mozambique. Portugal, one of Europe's poorest countries, found itself fighting 3 simultaneous guerrilla wars on 3 continents. Liberation movements like the MPLA, Frelimo in Mozambique, and PAIC in Guinea-Bissau received support from the Soviet Union, China, and newly independent African nations. They employed guerrilla tactics, ambushes, sabotage, building support among rural populations. Portugal responded with counterinsurgency, fortified villages, massive troop deployments. The colonial wars consumed Portugal. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Portugal was spending nearly half its national budget on military operations in Africa. Every young Portuguese man faced conscription and the likelihood of being sent to Africa for years-long deployments in the bush, fighting an enemy they often couldn't see, for a cause many didn't believe in. Thousands of Portuguese soldiers died. Estimates suggest around 8,000 killed and many more wounded, both physically and psychologically. The wars had no clear end in sight. Military officers, particularly younger ones who actually fought in Africa, grew increasingly disillusioned. They saw the futility of trying to maintain colonial control against determined nationalist movements, the impossibility of military victory, the moral bankruptcy of fighting to preserve an empire that the rest of the world condemned, and they blamed Salazar and the regime for stubbornly refusing to adapt, to negotiate, to recognize reality. In September 1968, Salazar suffered a massive stroke after a fall. He survived but was incapacitated, unable to govern. Rather than tell him he had been replaced, he was kept in a sort of protective fiction. The regime simply moved on. Marcelo Catano, a long-time regime insider, became prime minister. Catano was slightly more liberal than Salazar, allowing some relaxation of censorship and cautiously discussing potential colonial reforms, but he lacked the authority to fundamentally change the system. The Estado Novo continued, but without its architect. Salazar died in 1970, never knowing he had been replaced, a strange end for a man who had controlled Portugal so absolutely for so long. But the regime he built was crumbling, hollowed out by colonial wars, economic stagnation, and a younger generation, both in Portugal and the colonies, that refused to accept the status quo. The long dictatorship was entering its final years. By the early 1970s, Portugal was exhausted. The colonial wars showed no sign of ending. The economy stagnated under the weight of military spending, and younger generations, students, workers, even military officers, were questioning everything the Estado Novo represented. Censorship had relaxed slightly under Cottonno, allowing new ideas to circulate. Portuguese who travelled abroad, who studied in foreign universities, who fought in Africa alongside conscripts from all social classes, returned with changed perspectives. They saw that Portugal was isolated, trapped in the past, while the rest of Europe moved toward democracy and prosperity. Within the military, a clandestine organization formed, the Armed Forces Movement, or MFA, composed primarily of mid-ranking officers, captains and majors who had served in Africa and concluded that the wars were unwinnable and the regime was bankrupt. They began planning not just to end the wars, but to overthrow the dictatorship itself. The MFA's plans matured through 1973 and early 1974. They sought not a typical military coup to install a new strongman, but a revolution to restore democracy and decolonize. The movement grew carefully, recruiting sympathetic officers, coordinating across military units, awaiting the right moment. That moment came in the spring of 1974. On April 25, 1974, after midnight, the signal was given. The song Grandola Vila Morena by Zeca Afonso, a banned folk song associated with resistance to the regime, was played on Portuguese radio. It was the coded message for military units to begin the coup. Troops moved into Lisbon, occupying key government buildings, surrounding the headquarters of the Pied Secret Police, positioning tanks at strategic locations. The operation was coordinated, swift, and remarkably bloodless. By morning, it was clear the revolution had succeeded. Prime Minister Cottonno realized resistance was futile and surrendered, seeking refuge in the Carmo barracks in central Lisbon, which was soon surrounded by tanks and crowds. The people of Lisbon, realizing what was happening, poured into the streets in celebration. It was springtime, and women began placing red carnations, which were abundant in Lisbon's markets that day, into the barrels of soldiers' rifles and into their uniforms. The image became iconic. Soldiers with carnations instead of bullets, symbolizing a peaceful revolution. The Carnation Revolution, as it came to be called, had toppled Europe's longest surviving dictatorship in a single day with almost no bloodshed. The only deaths were 4 people killed by Pied agents firing on crowds outside their headquarters in a final, futile act of repression. By evening, Cottonno had surrendered to General Antonio de Spinola, one of the senior military figures associated with the MFA. The Estado Novo was over. Portugal was free. What followed was euphoric but chaotic. A period called the PREC, the Processo Revolucionário Caso, the ongoing revolutionary process, which lasted from 1974 to 1975. Portugal didn't simply transition to stable democracy. It experienced revolutionary ferment. Political prisoners were released. Censorship was abolished. Political parties that had been banned for decades re-emerged or were newly formed. The Portuguese Communist Party, which had maintained underground organization throughout the dictatorship, emerged as a powerful force. Socialist, Social Democrat, and various leftist parties competed for influence. Workers occupied factories, farmers seized land from large estates, particularly in the Alentejo where vast latifundia had dominated. There were celebrations, demonstrations, strikes, debates in every corner of society. But there was also confusion, competing visions of Portugal's future, and tensions between moderate and radical factions within the revolutionary movement itself. One of the revolution's immediate priorities was ending the colonial wars. The MFA was committed to decolonization, and negotiations began quickly. Guinea-Bissau had already declared independence in 1973, recognized by many nations though Portugal had not accepted it. Now Portugal acknowledged the reality. In 1975, Portugal granted independence to all its African colonies. Mozambique became independent on June 25, 1975, after Frelimo and Portugal reached agreement. Angola's path was more complicated. Three rival liberation movements competed for control, and civil war erupted even before independence on November 11, 1975, a conflict that would rage for decades with Cold War superpowers backing different factions. Cape Verde, São Tomé and Príncipe also gained independence in 1975. Portugal retained only Macau in Asia, which China was content to let Portugal administer until 1999, and East Timor, which Indonesia invaded in 1975, beginning a brutal occupation. The decolonization was rapid, sometimes chaotic, and led to massive refugee flows. Hundreds of thousands of Portuguese settlers and Africans fleeing the new nations returned to Portugal, called retornados, straining resources but also bringing skills and experiences. Portugal itself remained politically unstable through 1975. General Spinola, who had initially become president of the Transitional Junta of National Salvation, was more conservative than the radical elements within the MFA and wanted a gradual, controlled transition. But leftist forces, particularly those aligned with the Communist Party, pushed for deeper revolutionary changes. In September 1974, Spinola attempted a countermove to reassert control, but failed and resigned. The revolutionary process radicalized further. Banks were nationalized in March 1975. Major industries were taken over by the state. Agricultural land was collectivized in some regions. Some feared Portugal would become a communist state aligned with the Soviet Union. The United States and Western European nations watched nervously, concerned about NATO's southern flank. Portugal had been a founding member of NATO in 1949, and its strategic position was important to Western defense. The crisis peaked in November 1975. A radical leftist military faction attempted a coup on November 25, seeking to install a revolutionary government. But moderate military forces, including paratroopers loyal to moderates within the MFA, resisted. The coup was defeated, and its failure marked the end of the revolutionary period's most radical phase. The moderate socialists and social democrats gained ascendancy. Portugal would not become communist. It would become a pluralistic democracy with a mixed economy. Elections had already been held in April 1975 for a constituent assembly to write a new constitution, Portugal's first truly free elections in decades. The Socialist Party, led by Mário Soares, won the largest share, though not a majority, reflecting a population that wanted democracy and social justice, but not communist dictatorship. In 1976, Portugal adopted a new democratic constitution. The Constitution of 1976 established Portugal as a semi-presidential republic with a president elected by popular vote, a parliament, an independent judiciary, and guarantees of civil liberties and human rights. It reflected the revolutionary period's influence. It included commitments to socialism, workers' rights, and public ownership of key industries, but it was also flexible enough to accommodate future revisions as Portugal evolved. General Antonio Ramalho Eanes, a moderate military officer who had helped defeat the November 25 coup attempt, was elected Portugal's first constitutional president in June 1976. Mário Soares became prime minister. Democracy was being consolidated, institutions were being built, and Portugal was beginning the slow process of recovery and reconstruction after revolution, decolonization, and economic upheaval. The late 1970s were difficult years. Portugal was one of Western Europe's poorest countries, recovering from dictatorship and colonial wars, absorbing hundreds of thousands of refugees, building democratic institutions from scratch. Inflation was high, unemployment was a problem, infrastructure needed modernization. But there was also tremendous energy and hope. Artists, writers, musicians, filmmakers who had been censored or exiled could now create freely. Young people could speak, organize, travel, dream without fear. The country was learning democracy, how to debate, how to compromise, how to hold leaders accountable through elections rather than revolution or dictatorship. It was messy, sometimes frustrating, but it was free. And Portugal had a goal, a vision of its future, integration with Europe. Portugal had applied to join the European Economic Community, seeing membership as both economic opportunity and a way to lock in democratic reforms, to make dictatorship impossible to reimpose. That application, and the transformations it would bring, would define the next chapter of Portuguese history. The path to European integration was neither quick nor easy. Portugal's application to join the European Economic Community had been submitted even before the revolution, but after 1974, negotiations took on new urgency and meaning. For Portugal, joining what would become the European Union represented far more than economic opportunity. It was a civilizational choice, a commitment to democracy, human rights, and Western European values that would make any return to dictatorship virtually impossible. But first Portugal had to prove itself worthy. The European community had standards, functioning democracy, respect for human rights, economic stability, legal frameworks aligned with European norms. Portugal, in the late 1970s, was still building all of these. The negotiations took years, with Portuguese diplomats and politicians working tirelessly to convince European partners that Portugal was ready. Finally, on January 1, 1986, Portugal officially joined the European Economic Community, along with Spain, in what was called the Iberian Enlargement. It was a historic moment, a turning point in Portuguese history as significant as the Carnation Revolution itself. Membership brought immediate benefits: access to European markets for Portuguese goods, funding from European structural funds to modernize infrastructure, foreign investment attracted by stability and European integration, and the psychological boost of being welcomed into the community of prosperous Western European democracies. Portuguese farmers received subsidies, roads and bridges were built or renovated with European money, telecommunications were modernized, education systems were reformed. The European flag flew alongside the Portuguese flag, symbolizing a new identity. Portugal was Portuguese, yes, but also European, part of something larger than itself. The late 1980s and 1990s brought rapid changes to Portuguese society. Mário Soares, who had served multiple terms as Prime Minister during the difficult transition years, was elected president in 1986, becoming Portugal's first civilian president since the revolution, a symbolic milestone showing that the military had truly returned to the barracks and democracy was consolidated. Economic liberalization accelerated under various governments. State-owned enterprises were privatized, markets were opened, Portugal embraced globalization and European integration. Lisbon and Porto, Portugal's two major cities, were transformed. New metro systems, renovated historic districts, modern office buildings, international hotels and restaurants. Portugal was catching up, closing the development gap with Western Europe, though it remained one of the EU's poorer members. Portuguese society was changing in profound ways. Education expanded dramatically. Literacy rates, which had been shockingly low under the dictatorship, improved as generations attended school. Universities grew, and Portuguese students could now study across Europe through programs like Erasmus. Women entered the workforce and public life in unprecedented numbers. Under the dictatorship, women had faced severe legal restrictions, requiring their husbands' permission to work or travel, but democracy brought equality before the law and gradually, though incompletely, in practice. The Catholic Church, while still influential, no longer dominated public discourse. Divorce was legalized in 1975. Abortion would eventually be legalized after a referendum in 2007. Same-sex marriage would be approved in 2010. Portugal was becoming more secular, more liberal, more pluralistic, though these changes created tensions with older, more conservative populations, particularly in rural areas. In 1998, Portugal hosted Expo 98, a World's Fair held in Lisbon with the theme, The Oceans, a heritage for the future. It was Portugal's moment on the world stage, a coming-out party for the new democratic European Portugal. The Expo transformed a decayed industrial waterfront area along the Tagus into the Parque dos Nacos, a modern district of pavilions, parks, and the spectacular Oceanario, one of Europe's largest aquariums. Over 10 million people visited from around the world during the exposition, which ran from May to September. The event showcased Portuguese culture, history, and especially its maritime heritage, reminding the world and Portugal itself of the age of discovery, but reimagined for a modern context emphasizing environmental stewardship and global cooperation. The Vasco da Gama Bridge, at the time Europe's longest bridge, was built across the Tagus to improve access to the Expo site. Portugal had successfully organized a world-class international event, proving its capability and modernity. In 1999, Portugal took another significant step in European integration by adopting the euro as its currency. The escudo, which had been Portugal's currency since 1911, was replaced by the common European currency on January 1, 1999 for financial transactions, and euro coins and notes entered circulation in 2002. For older Portuguese who remembered the instability of the escudo, its frequent devaluations, the euro represented stability and confidence. For younger Portuguese, it meant seamless travel and trade across much of Europe. The euro also meant Portugal's economic policy was now partly controlled by European institutions. Monetary policy was set by the European Central Bank, and Portugal had to maintain fiscal discipline to meet European standards. This would later prove to be both blessing and constraint. Also in 1999, Portugal completed its decolonization process when it handed Macau back to China on December 20th. Macau, the tiny territory on the southern Chinese coast, had been under Portuguese administration since the 1550s, one of the longest colonial presences anywhere. The handover was ceremonial and peaceful, conducted with dignity on both sides. Portugal's flag was lowered, China's flag was raised, and Macau became a special administrative region of China, much as Hong Kong had 2 years earlier. With Macau's return, Portugal's global empire, which had once stretched from Brazil to Japan, was finally, definitively over. Portugal was now solely a European nation, though one with a global language. Portuguese is spoken by over 250 million people worldwide, the legacy of empire surviving in linguistic and cultural form even after political control has ended. The early 21st century brought both progress and crisis. Portugal continued modernizing, hosting matches for the Euro 2004 football championship, building new stadiums and infrastructure, basking in its team's achievements and in the stardom of players like Luis Figo and later Cristiano Ronaldo, who became global sports icons. But beneath the surface, problems were accumulating. Portugal had been living somewhat beyond its means. Public debt was rising. Economic growth was sluggish compared to other European nations. Productivity remained low. Wages stagnated. Then came the global financial crisis of 2008, triggered by the collapse of the U.S. housing market and Lehman Brothers, which spread across the world. Portugal, along with several other European nations, found itself in severe difficulty. By 2010, Portugal faced a full-blown sovereign debt crisis. The government struggled to borrow money at sustainable interest rates. Investors feared Portugal might default on its debts, and they demanded increasingly high interest to lend money to the Portuguese state. Austerity measures were imposed, cutting public spending, reducing salaries, raising taxes, but they weren't enough. In April 2011, Portugal formally requested a financial bailout from the European Union and the International Monetary Fund. The bailout package totaled 78 billion euros, conditional on Portugal implementing severe austerity measures, further cuts to public sector wages and pensions, tax increases, privatization of state assets, labour market reforms. It was a national humiliation, reminiscent of earlier moments of Portuguese vulnerability. The British ultimatum of 1890, the loss of Brazil, the forced submission to great powers. But it was also unavoidable. Without the bailout, Portugal would have defaulted on its debts, potentially exited the euro, and faced economic catastrophe. The bailout years, from 2011 to 2014, were difficult for Portugal. Unemployment rose above 17%, youth unemployment even higher. Many young educated Portuguese emigrated seeking opportunities abroad, to Britain, Germany, Brazil, Angola, echoing earlier waves of Portuguese emigration in the 1960s when people fled poverty and dictatorship. Public services were cut. Hospitals and schools struggled with reduced funding. Despair and anger were widespread. Yet Portugal also demonstrated resilience. The Portuguese people, with living memory of far worse times, dictatorship, colonial wars, revolutionary chaos, endured. The government, despite political changes, maintained commitment to the bailout program's requirements, and gradually progress was made. By 2014, Portugal successfully exited the bailout program, regaining access to international bond markets at reasonable rates. The economy began growing again, unemployment fell, investor confidence returned. Portugal had survived the crisis, though scars remained: a lost decade of growth, increased inequality, a generation marked by precarity and emigration. As Portugal moved through the 2010s and into the 2020s, it worked to rebuild and reimagine itself. The wounds of austerity slowly healed, though full recovery would take years. Portugal became known for new things. Its tech sector began growing, with Lisbon attracting startups and digital nomads. Tourism boomed, with millions of visitors drawn to Portugal's history, culture, cuisine, and relatively affordable prices compared to other Western European destinations. Portugal's wines, long exported but sometimes underappreciated, gained international recognition. The country that had once ruled the waves now found itself charting a different course. Smaller, more modest, but free, democratic, and increasingly confident in its modern identity. The 2010s brought political change that reflected Portugal's evolution. In 2015, elections produced an unusual result. The centre-right coalition that had implemented the bailout austerity measures lost its majority, and after complex negotiations, a left-wing coalition government formed. Antonio Costa, leader of the Socialist Party, became Prime Minister, heading a government supported by the Communist Party and the Left Bloc in an arrangement called the contraption, or geringonça, by skeptics who doubted it could work. Many observers, both domestic and international, predicted the coalition would quickly collapse or pursue reckless policies that would undo Portugal's recovery. Instead, the government surprised everyone by maintaining fiscal responsibility while reversing some of the harshest austerity measures, restoring public sector wages and pensions, reducing taxes for lower and middle incomes, increasing the minimum wage. The contraption lasted the full 4-year term and was renewed after the 2019 elections, demonstrating that Portuguese democracy had matured to the point where ideologically diverse parties could cooperate pragmatically. In 2017, Portugal received international recognition of a different kind. The Portuguese writer José Saramago had won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1998, but in 2017, Antonio Guterres, who had served as Portugal's Prime Minister from 1995 to 2002, was serving as Secretary-General of the United Nations, becoming the first Portuguese person to hold the position and bringing Portuguese diplomatic tradition to the world's most prominent international stage. That same year, tragedy struck. Devastating forest fires swept across central Portugal in June and October, killing over 100 people, many of them trapped in their cars as they tried to flee walls of flame. The fires, exacerbated by drought, heat waves, and eucalyptus plantations that burn intensely, revealed vulnerabilities in Portugal's forest management and emergency response systems. The nation mourned, and the government implemented reforms to prevent such catastrophes, but the fires served as a stark reminder of climate change's growing impacts on Mediterranean countries. Portugal's cultural influence in the modern world extends far beyond its borders. The haunting sound of fado, Portugal's traditional music of longing and melancholy, has been recognized by UNESCO as intangible cultural heritage. Musicians like Marisa and Carminho have brought fado to international audiences, performing in concert halls worldwide. Portuguese cuisine, long overshadowed by Spanish and Italian food in global awareness, has gained recognition. Lisbon became a destination for culinary tourism, with Portuguese chefs earning Michelin stars, and dishes like pastel de nata, bacalhau, and francesinha finding fans internationally. Portuguese cinema has gained attention through directors like Miguel Gomes and João Pedro Rodrigues, whose films screen at Cannes and other major festivals. Portugal's soft power, its culture, language, and historical connections, gives the small nation an outsized presence. In 2020, like the rest of the world, Portugal faced the COVID-19 pandemic. The virus arrived in early March, and Portugal quickly implemented strict lockdown measures to prevent healthcare system collapse. The first wave was managed relatively well compared to some European neighbours, with lower death rates initially. But subsequent waves, particularly in January 2021, overwhelmed hospitals. Portugal briefly had the world's highest infection and death rates per capita, with ambulances queuing outside hospitals, intensive care units at capacity. Healthcare workers, underpaid and exhausted, labored heroically under impossible conditions. The pandemic revealed both strengths and weaknesses, strong social solidarity and compliance with public health measures, but also healthcare system fragility after years of underinvestment. Economically, the pandemic devastated tourism, which had become crucial to Portugal's economy. Cities like Lisbon and Porto, which had been filled with visitors, became eerily quiet. The government implemented support measures, and European Union recovery funds helped, but recovery would take time. Modern Portugal faces challenges that are both uniquely Portuguese and common to many developed nations. The population is aging. Portugal has one of the world's oldest populations, with low birth rates and increasing life expectancy creating pressure on pension systems and health care. Young people face difficulties entering the housing market, particularly in Lisbon and Porto, where prices have soared, partly due to tourism and foreign investment driving up costs. Many young Portuguese continue to emigrate, seeking opportunities abroad, though some are returning as remote work becomes more common and quality of life considerations outweigh pure salary concerns. Portugal is also becoming more multicultural. Immigrants from former colonies like Brazil, Angola, and Cape Verde have long been present, but now Portugal also attracts immigrants from across Europe and Asia, refugees from conflicts, and retirees from wealthier countries seeking sun and affordability. This diversity enriches Portugal, but also requires adaptation and challenges old assumptions about Portuguese identity. Portugal has become a leader in renewable energy, a transformation driven by necessity and vision. With few fossil fuel resources and high energy import costs, Portugal invested heavily in wind, solar, and hydroelectric power. By the 2020s, renewable energy regularly supplied the majority of Portugal's electricity, some days even more than 100% of needs, with excess exported to Spain. Portugal set ambitious targets for carbon neutrality by 2050, and although challenges remain, particularly in transportation and agriculture, the commitment to clean energy represents both environmental responsibility and economic opportunity. The same country that once led maritime exploration is now exploring new frontiers in sustainability and green technology, finding ways to prosper while respecting planetary boundaries. In 2022, Portugal faced the hottest, driest year in nearly a century. Temperatures soared above 40 degrees Celsius (104 degrees Fahrenheit), reservoirs dropped to critically low levels, and fires again threatened communities. Climate change was no longer a distant threat, but a present reality reshaping Portuguese life. Agricultural patterns changing, water scarcity becoming chronic in some regions, ecosystems under stress. Yet Portugal also demonstrated adaptability, with communities implementing water conservation measures, farmers experimenting with drought-resistant crops, and policymakers developing climate adaptation strategies. The Portuguese have always understood that geography shapes destiny. The ocean determined their age of discovery, and now climate determines their necessary transformation. In November 2022, the United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP27, took place in Egypt, with Portugal sending delegations and reaffirming commitments, joining global efforts to address the greatest challenge of the 21st century. Today, as you listen to these words, Portugal continues its long journey through history. It is a nation of approximately 10 million people, speaking a language shared by hundreds of millions worldwide, member of the European Union and NATO, possessing a rich cultural heritage and a complex history of exploration, empire, dictatorship, and democracy. Portuguese society navigates between tradition and modernity. Ancient villages where traditional ways persist alongside cosmopolitan cities buzzing with technology startups. Fado houses where singers pour out saudade, that uniquely Portuguese sense of longing, while electronic music pulses in Lisbon nightclubs. Generations who remember dictatorship sharing streets with those born into democracy, who take freedom for granted while facing new uncertainties. Portugal in the 2020s faces the challenges common to many nations: economic inequality, political polarization, demographic change, climate crisis, technological disruption, but faces them with accumulated wisdom of survival, with resilience forged through centuries of triumph and tragedy. From the prehistoric cave dwellers to the present moment, from Celtic tribes to Roman colonization, from Moorish sophistication to Christian reconquest, from the birth of a nation to the creation of a global empire, from dictatorship's long night to revolution's dawn, from European integration to contemporary challenges, this is Portugal's story. It is a story that continues, that is being written today by every Portuguese person living their life, making their choices, dreaming their dreams. History is not only what happened in the past, but what connects past to present, what shapes the world we inhabit now. Portugal, small in size but vast in history, stands as testament to human persistence, to the power of culture and language, to the possibility of reinvention, to the endurance of a people who have survived everything history threw at them and remain, still Portuguese, still here, still becoming. And so the story continues, as it always has, as it always will, day by day, generation by generation, from the western edge of Europe toward whatever future awaits.